Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and the time is 9:15. This is day 2 of a 2-day meeting for the Physical Therapy Board of California, and today is Friday, September 14th, 2018. We're meeting today in the Department of Consumer Affairs hearing room located at 2005 Evergreen Street in Sacramento. May I please have roll call?
Alicia Benet-Men.
Here.
TJ Watkins.
Yeah.
Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer.
Here.
Katarina Ellaby.
Present.
Tanya McMillian. Tanya McMillian is absent. All members are present with the exception of Tanya McMillian, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. So let's start today with asking Dr. Daniel Drummer to please introduce the mission statement for the day.
Well, the mission statement for the day and for all time for the board, as we decided in April. The mission statement is to declare and describe what our purpose is, why we're here, and to remind us of what we're tasked with, and to remind our viewers and those in attendance about why we're here. The mission statement reads, "To advance and protect the interests of the people of California by the effective administration of the Physical Therapy Practice Act."
Thank you, Dr. Drummer. And I'd like to acknowledge the public members that are here in the audience today, and we will, with each agenda item, have public comment, and we invite you to come forward to the front microphone, introduce yourself, and participate in any public comment that you might have. And thank you, Sac State students, for being here today. So let's go to agenda item number 16. Oh, actually, sorry. Let's start with agenda item number 3, which were the minutes for our last meeting. We are going to table reviewing and approving those minutes until the December meeting so that board members have more time to review them. Okay, and then on to agenda item number 16, our legislation report with Brooke.
Okay, so as noted on the calendar, included in the meeting materials, August 24th was the last day for the Senate and Assembly to amend bills on the floor, and August 31st was the last day for each house to pass bills. September 30th is the last day for the governor to sign or veto bills passed by the legislature, and all statutes will take effect January 1st, 2019. I'll go ahead and direct members to the meeting materials, the legislative summary on page 239, and I'll go through each bill and provide an update. The first bill, AB 2078, Sex Offenses Professional Services, was held under submission on August 16th in the Senate. And the next bill on the ledge summary is AB 2138, Licensing Board's Denial of Application, Criminal Conviction. And on August 30th, the Senate amendments were concurred in, and it was enrolled and presented to the governor on September 11th. A letter of opposition was sent to the governor. The most recent amendments included a delayed implementation date of January 1st, 2020, and the 7-year washout period would not apply to a serious felony where registration is required and a financial crime that has been classified as a felony and is directly and adversely related to the profession.
Brooke, I just wanted to ask to clarify, with AB 2078 being held under submission in the committee, no action will take place this year. Is that correct? It potentially can be brought back next year, or will be brought back next year because it's held in committee now? Do we have a sense of that?
It can always be brought back. I think your question is where it has occurred in this legislative session. Has it become a second-year bill?
Correct.
And we're in the second year of that session. So this bill can be brought back by any author, for that matter, in the next legislative session.
But that requires reintroduction.
Correct.
So
and vetting.
It is in effect at this point dead.
Yes, in effect.
And then just to clarify with 2138, that it is enrolled to the governor means that it is awaiting his action. It's just been turned to his office, awaiting either signature, veto, or inaction, which essentially vetoes it. without a signature. Is that correct?
That is correct. Another point on 2138, I have also issued a letter as the administrator of the board in opposition of that bill for the governor's view, as well as a number of other executive officers and directors in the Department of Consumer Affairs. So we've made that second attempt. While the board has issued a letter of opposition, now that it is sitting on the governor's desk, I have, in representation of the board, also issued a letter of opposition, asking for a veto.
And he has until the 30th?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, so AB 2221 on page 242 of the meeting materials, Occupational Therapy Practice Act. On August 29th, the Assembly concurred with the Senate's amendments, and on September 10th, it was enrolled and presented to the governor. Okay, and AB 2386, there's no updates on this bill as it was held under submission in the Assembly Appropriations Committee on August 25th.
Which bill?
I'm sorry, you said 2386?
Correct.
I don't
It's not agenda.
see that on the agenda.
So moving on to AB 2423, Physical Therapist, direct access to services, plan of care approval. On August 30th, the Assembly concurred with the Senate's amendments, and it was enrolled and presented to the governor on September 10th.
And if the board might remember, this board has actually offered a letter of support for that bill to the legislature.
And AB 3110, athletic trainers. Oh, excuse me, that one's not agendized.
3110 is agenda.
But
Did you
2958
address
is
2958?
Okay, so AB 3110, athletic trainers, was held under submission on August 16th in the Senate Appropriations Committee.
Has 2958
I'm
been
sorry.
addressed?
No, let me pull that one. One moment, please. Thank you.
I'm sorry, is that on our current agenda?
2958 is. So AB 2958, state bodies, meetings, teleconference. This bill for a state body that is an advisory board, advisory commission, advisory committee, advisory subcommittee, or similar multi-member advisory body would authorize an additional way of holding a meeting by teleconference, provided that it also complies with all other applicable requirements of the Badgley-Keene Open Meeting Act. On August 29th, the Senate amendments were concurred in, and on September 10th, it was enrolled and presented to the governor. So it's awaiting his action. Okay, so 8B, or SB 1448. Healing Arts licensees, probation status disclosure. On August 31st, the Assembly amendments were concurred in, and it was ordered to engrossing and enrolling.
Any board comment on any of the bills? Do we have any public comment on any of the bills? Okay. So I think it's okay to move on to agenda item number 17, the rulemaking.
Okay, so the rulemaking tracking form lists all current rulemaking items from the 2018 rulemaking calendar that was adopted at the November 2017 board meeting. The first item on the tracking form is the satisfactory documentary evidence of equivalent degree for licensure as a PT or PTA coursework tool. PTB staff and DCA Legal are working on preparing the initial rulemaking package for completing the new review process implemented by DCA. The second item on the rulemaking form is the examination passing standard, setting examination score. And PTBC has incorporated DCA legal edits into the proposed language, and we will be presenting language under Agenda Item 17B today. The next item is the disciplinary guidelines, and final language was approved at the March 2018 board meeting, and PTB staff are finalizing the notice and initial statement of reasons to send to DCA Legal for their review. And I'm going to skip down to the clinical service requirements for foreign educated applicants rulemaking, and we'll be presenting proposed language under 17E today for the board's consideration. And all other items on the tracking form, the board staff will be working on and presenting at a later meeting.
I had a question. Which one did you say was sent to legal for review?
The coursework tool? Are you,
Yeah, just for clarification, I don't believe that has been sent to legal for
Not
review.
sent. Staff will be working with
we'll be
legal.
working to.
Okay, it just hasn't been sent to legal yet, so.
Any questions from the members about the report itself, or would you like to move on to the next
Yeah, let's,
sub?
any discussion? Yeah.
So 17B, discussion on possible board action regarding examination passing standards, setting the examination score. You have a handout with proposed language. There are a couple notations that I'd like to kind of point out in that language. With the help of counsel, it was kind of, there was a question asked whether or not in the board's mandate, in our statutes that say the board shall set a passing score in regulation, whether or not in that there was authority for us to defer our score setting to FSBPT, which is the language that we had brought to you at the prior meetings. And then, I think in another attempt at just greater clarity, we edited the language just to include the score itself. I think it's a much more transparent way for our stakeholders to come to the rules and see that it's just not another step that they have to go to the Federation and see what the score is, that it's just clearly stated in the language. And so that's what you have before you today.
Looks pretty straightforward.
Is there a concern about using a particular number, citing a particular number because the MPT might come to a different format and a different scoring system might be determined at a later date?
I just want to let the board know that I had not had a previous opportunity to look at this new draft and proposed language, so that is certainly an issue that I can take a look at and provide the board with advice at future time.
I would say that it was discussed, and in our previous meetings, that was one of the reasons that we had thought about deferring it to the Federation's pass point. But in those conversations and those questions about whether or not we had the authority to do that, using the actual pass point was a bit of a concern, but having conversations with the Federation and the way that they go about setting those standards, there is no foreseen potential that they might vary from that number. In fact, the actual forms would be weighted to where that is the pass point regardless. But that is one of the things that we also discussed with legal in our consultation, so we can look into it further.
Not that we're bound to do what other boards do, but do we know if other boards of other jurisdictions have set a number or?
I think
And-
I think it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or even state to state, whether that's even a mandate that the board shall. In our particular circumstance, that is, the statute says the board shall do the following, and one of those subs is set a pass point. And if you think about the analogy that I could paint for that is the TOEFL score, where we've been very specific about the numbers for each different category in the TOEFL score. And then having to rationalize why we've chosen those particular numbers. I think this is very much akin to that.
And do we have information as to what other jurisdictions have set as their passing score?
No.
If they might have?
All jurisdictions in the United States defer to that 600 that FSBPT enforces. That much I can tell you. Whether or not they have that explicitly stated in their statutes or rules, I can't.
And the score of 600 is a raw score out of a possible how many? Do we know that?
800.
800.
Just to make another point, so there is precedent. The GRE previously 200 to 800 was the scale. Now, the 5-6 years ago at least, the scale is now 130 to 170. So most academic institutions are using percentile.
Mm-hmm.
Just a possibility. So you get away from tying yourself in statute to a number when the range or the actual raw score might change.
So it sounds like the board members do have some concern about a number being here, or?
Well, and just to follow that up, if statute says that that we shall determine a score, can we determine a percentile that is not a score? It's a ratio. I mean, instead, is that an acceptable determination, or are we bound to pick a score based on what the law says?
So I think I could provide some feedback here as reference. This is something that legal and myself has been going over with board staff. So initially, this language that was passed by the board addressed adopting the score of FSBPT's exam. And the reason that was called into question was there's Business and Professions Code section 851 that suggests that the board is to set the score. And there were other of the board's specific laws and regulations that indicated that it's the board that sets the score. And so there was a question about whether or not the board delegating that authority to FSBPT was appropriate. So the couple of options that were presented and discussed with staff were maintaining that language and deferring it to FSBPT, but in the rulemaking package, the board being very clear that it had considered the process by which FSBPT set that score and why it was set at that particular score, and just really focusing on that analysis and justification for why FSBPT's score is reasonable and why the board's adopting that score. That would avoid the issue of having to go back and update the regulations if FSBPT were to change the passing score, which I think the issue that was just brought up. And I think Jason will probably recollect it better than me, but there's a particular method that FSBPT uses. Is it Emhoff or Enghoff? Enghoff method. And so if that were discussed in the rulemaking package, then it may be acceptable. That might be an option to the board as opposed to setting a particular score. What we talked about previously with board staff is that there is another part of the board's regulations that does set specific score, and that's with that rulemaking tool. And so when the Office of Administrative Law is looking at rulemaking packages, one thing we talked about is they do look for consistency. But I'm not sure that that's the type of consistency that they would have a problem with, because this isn't about, consistent language or how something is worded. This is very substantive. So, the board doesn't necessarily need to refer to a particular score, I think, in order to maintain that kind of level of consistency. If the board did choose 600, again, the board would have to go through that process in the rulemaking package to justify why 600. It sounds like maybe the justification is that that's the score that FSBT relies on, and then you would again go into that analysis of, yes, the Enghoff method is the appropriate method, and that's how this score was chosen. So I think that the board can go either way, but there is that risk that if the score changes for FSBT, the board would have to come back and look at it again. But in my conversations with Jason, my understanding is that doesn't happen very often. The FSBT, I don't know, maybe Jason can clarify how long it's been since they've changed their score.
The scoring method, since the Federation took over the administration of the national exam, has been at that level of 600. The variation has been when the exam has changed hands from one vendor to another. And so some might remember that the national examination at one time was actually handled by the American Physical Therapy Association. And while that was under a different methodology, which had a different result, since the Federation has been the administrator of that exam, they've always relied on Enghoff and that score setting method.
Hearing the concerns of the other members, I think that if our statute states that the board shall set the score, I don't feel like there's an issue in explicitly stating that in the language under this section, especially since FSBPT has used this score consistently and has no plans to change it in the near future. As you mentioned, Jason, it makes it a lot easier and transparent for our stakeholders to know what the standard is that we're setting.
Another thing I would add is just to keep in mind that this is the proposed language itself. There's always going to be the initial statement of reasons and the rationale behind it, and we'll speak to those issues about methodology and the Enghoff method and why we've chosen to use this score. And as Sawa said, one of those things being that it conforms with the national standard that the Federation uses for other jurisdictions, which allows for portability from one state to another and those kind of things, and a little bit more uniformity. I have, jotted down in my to-dos, though, to have a conversation with FSBPT regarding the conversion method of that raw score, maybe thinking of a percentile or something like that. In my previous conversations with FSBPT, there was no concern that they expressed to us about putting 600 into a regulation, and then if they were going to make plans to change it in any way, use a different scoring method or something like that, I would ask that they would notify us in enough time that we could adjust if we needed to.
So what are the board's options today, if any, for taking action on what's before us?
The board has a few options. The board has the option to not act and review the language and have legal look into it more. The board has the option of adopting the proposed language in front of it. There are two documents relating to proposed language. So the second one hasn't been discussed. I'm only talking about 1398.28. So it can adopt this language. Or the board can choose to maintain the language it previously adopted. So the board would have to, I think, has already made a prior motion to adopt other language. So the new motion would be to adopt this amendments to the language.
Do members feel strongly against explicitly stating the score in the language, the proposed language?
Not at all. I mean, my question was whether or not there might be an implication about problem, or whether there could be problems with it. Hearing the discussion and the explanation, I don't think it's something that is a looming storm that we need to prepare for. I think we'll be okay with it.
And so do we have a suggested action or motion today?
I move to adopt the amended proposed language for 1398.28 as provided.
We've got a motion from Dr. Drummer and a second by Mr. Watkins. Any further board discussion? Further board smiles?
Before we finalize, I'd ask, Sawa may have some more formal language to add to that to empower the executive officer to move forward with the rulemaking package and make any non-substantive change, those kind of things. But
Yeah.
there is some template language that should be used.
Yeah. So again, I wasn't aware that board action would be taken on this item, or that it was going to be brought up today. So I specifically, so I'm trying to find that scripted language. If the board would allow for a few minutes, I might be able to find it.
Is it okay to ask for public comment while you're looking? Is there any public comment? Okay. Are you able to pull up previous motion?
I'm trying right now.
Last meeting.
So in this instance, I think it would be to approve the proposed amended text presented today and incorporate these. No, I'm sorry. Direct the executive officer to take all steps necessary to initiate the rulemaking process. Authorize the executive officer to make any technical or non-substantive changes to the rulemaking package notice. The proposed text for 45-day comment period, and if no adverse comments are received and no hearing is requested, adopt the proposed regulatory changes as modified.
The maker of the motion would accept those friendly amendments.
You need a second?
So I just want to clarify the procedure that we're using, and the board can decide on the procedure it wants to use. This has come up before. There's been a motion, there's been a second. I think Dr. Drummer just suggested a motion to amend, so I think as a separate motion. I wanted to clarify with the board, I know this has been a previous issue, but though the administrative manual suggests, it states that Robert's Rules of Order will be guidance for the board. The board's administrative manual is not the law as a primary issue. As a second, Robert's Rules of Order, even if it were, is just guidance. So the board is not obligated to follow Robert's Rules of Order precisely. Robert's Rules of Order are really intended for much larger meetings where you have very large audiences and they participate, and so that's why Robert's Rules of Order are done the way they do. And as a part of Robert's Rules of Order, it states that Robert's Rules of Order can be changed as need. So it's very flexible. So the board can engage in the more formalized motion to amend the motion, or the board can take action, as long as the board is taking action that is clear for the record what it's trying to accomplish, then it doesn't necessarily have to follow those formalized rules. So if the board agrees that they simply want to, if the first and the second agrees that they want to amend their motion and there is no objection from the rest of the board, we can simply proceed with that motion without having to do multiple motions.
Yeah, simplify it.
Is that something that the board would like to do?
That was my hope, was simply accepting friendly amendment and
Okay.
not having to go through formal amendment process, so.
A friendly amendment? Okay. So let's do that.
Any further comment? Would you like a roll call vote?
Yes.
Perhaps public comment on the amended motion.
Okay, any public comment on the amended motion at all? Thank you. Okay, roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benayemen.
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Ellaby.
Aye.
Tanya McMillian. Tanya McMillian is absent. 5-0, motion carried.
Thank you. Okay.
And so if you'd like, we can move on to 17E.
Yes, please.
Discussion on possible board action on the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy's FSBPT Performance Evaluation Tool for foreign educated physical therapists completing a supervised clinical practice in the United States. Again, this is a familiar topic for the members. We've discussed it at a number of different meetings. We have an existing system that utilizes the APTA's clinical performance instrument, which is a paper form that, while we use it currently, is a bit outdated compared to some of the things that are happening in the industry with APTA modernizing that form for the use of CAPTE accredited graduates and creating a web-based tool. And if you recall, we had discussion about the newly introduced product by FSBPT, which is their SCP PET, or what we call the PET, as an alternative that is third-party validated and contains the same and a little bit more than what APTA's clinical performance instrument does, because it was designed specifically for foreign educated graduates. The previous discussions that we had were to create language that would allow for the submission of any of those three, either the CPEI that we currently use, the online version that's used in the CAPTE accreditation schools, and then the performance evaluation tool as offered by the Federations of State Boards. One of the things that we realized during our research was, while doing all three was, generally a good idea, we did come to the realization that the second option, using the online system that the CAPTE accredited programs use, is inaccessible to anyone other than a CAPTE school. So what you have in front of you is language that has removed that and only accepts either the existing CPEI, which has been around since 1997, but is explicitly authorized by the APTA to use for the evaluation of foreign educated, and then the Federation's new PET tool.
Can you please say that last statement?
The APTA has a statement attached to the 1997 edition of the Clinical Performance Instrument that essentially says that they're willing to let outside agencies use that tool for the sole purpose of evaluating foreign accredited graduates
Thank you.
for the purpose of licensure.
has a side-by-side comparison of what's evaluated between the two tools been done so that we can feel comfortable that if one applicant is being reviewed with the 1997 CPI versus another applicant being evaluated using the FSBPT tool, that they're on line with each other, they're on par with each other?
Yeah.
Have we looked at that?
We have, and if you might remember a presentation by FSBPT about the performance evaluation tool, and one of the structures of its design is that it's essentially based on that CPI model, and then adds in the additional steps to talk about the differences between culture and custom from the United States healthcare system and any other healthcare system that they might have experienced outside.
When you say it's built on the CPI model, what are you talking about as far as structure of the exam?
Structure. So
Okay.
the structure of the evaluation being a two-step process and evaluating a good deal of the same criteria, and requiring that both of those two-step processes be included in the evaluation at the end for the purpose of licensure.
So I don't have the PET in front of me. I am familiar with the CPI, but the PET, I recall, has 6 criteria, and the CPI has 18 criteria, because there's so many more things you want to look at for a new grad versus an experienced therapist. The other difference that I remember is that the CPI has a range of anchors, and the PET was a yes/no click.
And the yes/no clicks, adding to another range setting in the end, almost an average for that particular category. So there are differences in the way that it's done, but the essential components of what's being assessed and what's being evaluated is very similar to what's in the CPI. And to answer Dr. Drummer's question about whether or not we actually have any kind of information or statistics to show that both tools tend to yield the same results, we don't. The PET is a very new tool, other than that third-party validation that was mentioned. So as part of their research, that was something that they looked at and running it through, but no real life experience statistics.
I hope it's okay to say I almost wish we had some PTs and foreign-educated PTs who could talk about their experience with, that would be helpful to hear. I know anecdotally I've heard from a foreign-educated physical therapist who did use the CPI tool say that her and her clinical instructor or supervising physical therapist would say, well, would you put down for number such and such? Because it didn't pertain to her as a seasoned physical therapist, foreign-educated physical therapist. So it just would be nice to have that information or that perspective, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
It could-
Well, I recall also that there was some issues around the rollout, that the FSBPT tool, they don't have the infrastructure to roll it out because the instructors weren't familiar with the tool, whereas you had to get certified under the other current tool. And there was a discrepancy that it was held in a certain esteem by the profession as a tool being used, and that the FSBPT was in an experimental stage trying to establish that. That's critical when we're talking about this, because if it's already a practice within any profession, that is the first go-to. So now FSBPT is a responsibility, or one of their things that they needed to do was to make sure that they bring that in front of people. And that's why I would be interested in seeing actual people giving us information about their experiences with the different tools.
Yeah.
And how well it worked for them, and certain outcomes. Because it's good to have statistics, but I think when you're making a decision like this, you want to have it be outcomes based, that there is at least a support for it. Otherwise, we're entering just experimental. And experimental is for research companies.
So full disclosure, I do sit on the Foreign Educated Standards Committee of FSBPT, and I know that they are looking at the limited amount of data that they have right now for those who have used it, but the numbers are not large as of now.
There's a circular difficulty in that, though, in that, as just using California as an example, because our mandate is required to use the CPEI, there's very little room for the pet to get that statistical data backed behind it. Now, we, for a very long time, since the beginning of the rollout, have asked for volunteers to do both. And we've never had anyone take us up on that offer. And I can understand that. It's asking them to do double work to a certain extent. And I think that's the difficulty that FSBPT runs across with this particular tool, because all of the states have these, anyway, those that require a clinical service period for foreign have very similar requirements to California, in that so far we've always relied on the clinical performance instrument. And having said that, I think all of us who have been in that situation still have a want, to a certain extent, that the CPEI cannot fulfill, because it was designed to evaluate a CAPTE accredited graduate in the U.S. healthcare system. There's a small bit of information that's missing. And actually, I take that back. It's not really small. It's kind of huge, right? I mean, it's really trying to compare apples to oranges to a certain extent. So it's a kind of a circular problem. It depends on where you want the snake to eat its own tail.
Mm. So as an aside to the two instruments that are listed here, every time I look at this language, I see something else that I kind of want to address. And one of the things is that sometimes the supervising physical therapist is referred to as the supervising physical therapist, and sometimes that person is referred to as a CI.
Mm-hmm.
I think perhaps making that consistent throughout the regulation might be helpful. And I personally feel like the supervising physical therapist is a better choice than clinical instructor, even though that person is a clinical instructor, or it can be / clinical instructor. Same thing with foreign educated applicant. So the title of this does include foreign educated applicant as the title of the person, but throughout the document, sometimes that person is referred to as a PTLA. And I think that might be confusing to the public. So making that consistent, I think, can be helpful. Another comment I have, although we've spoke about this before, is that I do still have a concern about, well, let's start with the first paragraph. The period of clinical service required by Section 2653 of the Code shall be certified by at least one supervising physical therapist. In quotations, the supervising physical therapist is the center coordinator of clinical education and/or the clinical instructor. So I don't know that that language is necessary. Is there a reason why, that you can recall, we have that in there?
In some instances, you may have a number of clinical instructors at a facility, but the facility still has to have one center coordinator. They may be the same person.
Mm-hmm.
In some instances, you might have one person who serves both roles. And so I think this is just to define that either or can do it, or either or can be identified as that.
What does that mean to us, the board? Why do we need to call that out?
I think it's important because it shows that the supervising physical therapist for the foreign trained therapist, the whole thing, the whole episode of the foreign trained therapist's existence in that setting for training to be able to be ready for licensure, that the whole education clinical time is being supervised by somebody who has that proper authority, that proper background. a suggestion that I might make is instead of saying and/or the clinical instructor, say and/or a APTA certified clinical instructor, because then it takes it to the level that I think it needs to be. By just saying the clinical instructor, it leaves it open, because we're still not at a point where every clinical instructor has to be a certified clinical instructor.
Too
Credentialed
generic,
clinical instructor.
too generically titled.
And that's called out in C.
Correct.
C does say all clinical instructors must be APTA certified. So going back to paragraph A, the role of the Center Coordinator of Clinical Education is to coordinate a clinical experience. So their job is to either receive a request from someone who wants an experience at their site and then help to fulfill that request, or receive information from a practicing PT who wants to be open to having a student or a foreign educated applicant, and then that site coordinator finding someone to fill that spot. So with that being that person's job, I don't know why else a CCCE would be called out here.
So there are requirements that are stated in other parts of this section where there is going to be a CCCE and there's going to be a CI, because we're also going to look at the facility itself and make sure that it meets the criteria stated in statute and reg. And I think this is just to define that person could be one and the same. If it's a small enough setting, this clinical instructor may very well be the CCE as well.
I agree. I just don't know why that needs to be said in regulation.
So, as I'm looking at this language, it does something that it presupposes that these two tools are equal. And it's not really equal. It's not really equal because this newer tool has not produced the outcome of at the level that the previous tool has. So that is foundational. That is actual fundamental. And so by adding it into the language or bringing it as equal to it, we are saying we are accepting the experimental aspect as a risk that the board is taking on throughout California. And I am cautious of doing that. And I'm cautious of doing that for two reasons. Just because there's a blind spot on what is the actual outcome that it ultimately produces. Even if I give someone the choice. You see, when you go for something that is innovative and it solves a problem, until that problem is actually really solved with, real data, it's going to be really difficult to put it on par. The one is getting the outcome, the other one is not getting the outcome. And by putting them on par with each other, you are saying, I am accepting the deficiencies that is on the surface existing in it. And you can't overcome that downstream if it doesn't, and it can go scenarios. Everybody can say, no, we'll just pick the old tool. No worries. It's still in the language. But then it's obsolete in the language also if they're going to choose it anyway. If we say that this tool is on par, then can we put it on the merit that it's on par? And I'm questioning whether on merit it's on par.
Mm-hmm. I would ask if there has been any outcomes from using the CPI for foreign educated physical therapists. I mean, I'm not aware of any studies that have been done that measures that. And so to say that just because we've been using the CPI that, we've got certain outcomes, I don't think that's accurate. We've been using the CPI because we don't have anything else to use.
So that is it. So when you put an applicant through the system, and they have been using this existing system, and we can label it not up to standard next to the new tool or whatever. The deal is someone went through the system and came out a professional at the other end. That's an outcome. That's a tangible outcome. Now, if I take that same person and I put them through this system and I still get that outcome at the other end, but it's only a few people, then the data suggests there's not enough data.
The unfortunate.
And the deal, what I'm saying is that if FSBP showed me some real numbers, like 100 or 200 people that have gone through this process, right, then I can better manage that risk. Right now, I'm not sure that I am even attempting to manage that risk. That's just my perception, you know.
When someone goes through the foreign educated applicant process and a supervised clinical practice, and they make it out and they become licensed, I don't think we have studied, or I'm not aware of any studies where we have tied that success directly to the CPI, to the tool. So I'm not sure that we can make that leap, that all of those who have successfully completed a supervised clinical practice who've been measured on the CPI have done so because they've been measured on the CPI.
So that's even more interesting because now you're saying that both tools are obsolete. If you just put anything in place and get someone through that process.
This is true. We don't have the data.
Just an interjection. So, not to the point that it's obsolete, because there are people that don't make it through on both sides, whether they're CAPTE accredited graduates or foreign, that cannot make it through the clinical service period because, based on the opinion of their evaluator, they're just not ready. And so whether or not they require additional months or fail out altogether, I don't have those statistics to show you. The comparative between the two is a very important topic, and it is something, I mean, it is at an experimental stage. The unfortunate kind of symptom of the system is that there's no way for them to have that case study and get those statistics to show that one is equivalent to the other, because there's no incentive for any clinical instructor at this point to use that tool, because every state has an existing mandate to use a tool to evaluate foreign that was designed to evaluate a U.S. graduate. And so they're trying to address this kind of inconsistency and frustrations that a number of the states have expressed, saying it's kind of hard to shoehorn what they want to evaluate in a foreign accredited graduate into that existing U.S. standard. And I think FSBPT, through its third-party validation, made every attempt to create an equal to or greater than, right? So it's the idea of, that's why I say in its core, it's evaluating some of the very same things that CAPTE would evaluate, and then a few more things that the states have pointed out as saying, this seems to be missing in the existing system for foreign standards because it was designed for U.S. educated graduates. This really is, there is a level of risk, there is no doubt. I mean, you would be accepting a new tool, but unfortunately, until somebody accepts that new tool, no statistics will ever be revealed to compare it with.
Jason, did I hear you say that the FSBPT created a tool that's equal to and adds more than the CPI?
That's the essence of it, yes.
The essence, even if there are just 6 criteria or however many criteria?
Correct.
Okay.
Well, you see, I take everything like this. Who says it? If FSBPT says it, or people that have done services or contracted to them, you know, I will accept it, but I will accept it with a certain weight.
Yeah.
So now we'll do the third-party deal. If, as an example, if I don't have quantitative data, then I go qualitative. Let's do it there. And that would be bringing experts into a room that have experience with the old tool, and so come bring it with the new tool. And they do oh, yeah, this is helpful. This is helpful. Now I am not, in this case, to make a better decision. I would have more reliance on that then, in the absence of that quantitative data. Now I've got qualitative data of people that are actually working there. outside of my experience base, but now will take on their expertise and say, oh, okay, if they found it and they have used this tool for the last 10 years, and they say, oh, this is a total upgrade, that's more weighted
Sure.
for me. Then I'm all over this to say, okay, let's adopt the language, let's put them on equal par. But I'm not so fast to do that because I still believe that more can be done. And that's maybe a research background.
To Mr. Watkins' point, I think a number of you might have, recalled I have been skeptical, to say the least, about products that are provided to us by outside entities. What I would ask you to recall is the presentation that FSBPT did about the performance evaluation tool. And while I need that same kind of trust but verify assurance, they did have a very reputable outside firm come in and do that third-party validation to look at the existing method and the method that they're proposing to make sure that the outcomes would be reasonably the same. If I had those concerns, I wouldn't be presenting this language to you today.
Yeah, and for me, if everybody's comfortable, I felt that needed to be raised to a level of attention, just to give it, a kind of a fresh look.
And I
Before
appreciate you
accept
saying it
language.
because it speaks to the perspective that this board should be, and the scrutiny that this board should be applying to these kind of ideas anyway.
And that was my objective, was just to bring some big spotlight to it, saying, before we're looking at language and putting them on equal par, let's look a little closer. And I felt that if by saying that and raising it, that, we've been diligent in performing that duties.
And then just kind of a notation or maybe a commentary, editorial from the administrator of the program, if you will. Should this, be adopted by the board and implemented, I could envision a period of time where through evaluation, we've, staff and I have determined that it is not sufficient, and I would be coming back to the board to have it removed from the regulatory language because I don't find it as a,
Sure.
Beneficial tool. So.
Dr. Drummer?
A question and then a potential proposal. How many foreign trained applicants do we get in a year?
I don't have that statistic for you right now.
Less than 100?
Ms. Conley?
Yeah, and there's about 400 and so pending. So at any one time, we have about the same influx being granted that are being applied.
That's a good number.
Okay. And then a follow-up question that came into mind. Are the same supervising clinical physical therapists providing the clinical education, the clinical site experience for a large number of those applicants, or are they, do we know, are they fluctuating all across the state? That
Both.
there's not really
Both. I mean, we see clinical instructors' names popping up quite a bit that are,
Okay.
Providing those services for multiple applicants. But,
Okay.
We do. Now, the other thing that I would ask to keep in mind, too, is there's nothing in this proposal of language that suggests that we remove some of those other requirements, like, and all clinical instructors shall be APTA certified, because I think that training is very valuable to have in using the assessment, but looking at the documents between the two as just being the collection of that information and those observations of that clinical instructor.
And then on to the potential proposal, if it might be workable. Could we add language so that for a certain number of time, for 3 years, until what years? Until 2021, both instruments will be utilized. And so then we could actually come up with our own comparative information that we would have. And then at 2021, it would transition to one or the other. That way, we would be ensuring that we're achieving all of the data that that Mr. Watkins had brought up, and I think would help to alleviate some of the other concerns that may not have been said at this point. Could that be an option?
It's certainly an interesting idea. In a sense, you would be putting a sunset clause into a regulation.
Why, thank you.
And the only thing that I guess I would be wary of is that for me would be a standalone regulation, right? So I would leave the existing regulation language alone so that once that sunset period of the language came, we could still continue to rely on the parent regulation in that matter. But I'll ask council to kind of chime in because, like I said, that's an extremely interesting idea.
I think that if the board is interested in seeing that kind of language in the proposed text, that's certainly something that board staff can amend and include and present to me, and then I can review and advise the board at a later time.
If I may stop and ask if there's any public comment or anyone who's had experience as a foreign educated physical therapist, not experience supervising a foreign educated physical therapist. Yes, please come forward and state your name. Take your time. Mhm. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome, Mr. Van der Ven.
My name is Floris Van der Ven, for the records. I am a foreign-trained physical therapist, and I've also had several students that were foreign-trained and that I signed up to become a licensed physical therapy in the United States. The first thing I want to say, the CPI is a model that everyone pretty much knows. The only problem with it is not validated for foreign trained people and for people that have been in practice for a while. And more importantly, the last revision of this instrument was done in 2006. We've had quite a few changes in our practice in the last 12 years, so it's becoming more and more of a problem. What I did with the students that I had was I pretty much added my own things. I was also a member of the foreign trained committee of the FSBPT, so I knew well about the instrument, and I put that language in the CPI, even though it wasn't originally in there. And as a result of that, these people really learned to work with the U.S. system rather than the systems they were from.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Flores. What questions does the board have?
Do you have any experience with the PET?
Not with the PET as such. As I said, I was involved in the development of it, but we never really had it available while I was there. I used the language of the instrument to ask the questions and to train the foreign trained people, but I did not use that instrument per se.
Thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So you said you used the language that was in the current instrument?
That was put into the PET later on.
Oh, but you have not had experience with actually utilizing.
That's correct. It wasn't validated or anything.
Even in that experience, when you were, developing language for the new PE team, what was your experience being part of the team? And this is more of where I'm coming from. Was it with the mind to innovate and to make it easier?
I think it did that because we never really had language about the language that you need to use for your patients and the type of insurances and things that we have in the United States that are totally foreign to a lot of foreign trained people, and that kind of things were definitely useful.
And my final question was, were you able to infuse your experience into that language, like into, the PET?
I was involved pretty early on while this was being developed. So I hope that some of that experience got in there, but I'm not really sure if it actually got in there or not.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? And Flores, can you just give your opinion of your experience with the CPI and using it for foreign educated physical therapist applicants?
The CPI, as such, it's a tool to look at certain aspects, but it definitely lacks some depth. It's not only not validated; it's also old. So you pretty much, if you use that, you have to use it as a tool and not as the law. You really have to say, is this person really qualified or not? And really, at that point, a tool is really not good enough anymore. You have to say, yes, it's good enough, or no, it's not good enough. And that's what you put in the documentation to the board to let them know this is what my opinion is.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, what I find is that a lot of foreign-trained applicants look at the requirements that we have and instead decide to go just over the board and apply for a license there.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not necessarily a good thing because we lose a lot of well-qualified people, I think, that way. But
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you want us to know or you want to say as we consider this matter?
not necessarily.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
We
listening.
appreciate it. Any other public comment on this matter?
I think I would be remiss if I didn't express maybe some of the concerns that I've shared with you previously, just as a refresher, in using the existing CPI tool, and staff is sitting in the audience. So we have had situations where it makes it very difficult. Essentially, the CPEI, in a nutshell, is a way for that instructor to vouch for this person's readiness for licensure. And this board and its staff relies on that instrument to indicate whether they are or are not. And the CPI, as it's formed in design, speaks to a continuum and then has an opportunity for that instructor to comment. And we have experienced times where the comments are very positive, but that isn't demonstrated in the continuum indicated, and vice versa, where it's very positive on the continuum, but the comments lead us to ask further questions. And so there's a back and forth, a correspondence between us and the instructor to say, given what you provided to us in the instrument thus far, we don't really know if you're saying that this person is ready or not. Could you please clarify? And I think that is one of the benefits of the PET, is that it's very decisive at that point. They either are or they're not, and there's an indicator that represents that. So I wanted to share that with you. The other part was, in our previous discussions, and I want to make sure that I understood this clearly from the last time that we looked at this language, the board had instructed staff to formulate language to include all three. And it was just our revelation that the second option of the online CPI, the modernization, really, we shouldn't be considering that because there's an access issue to it. So without having to rehash the whole idea of doing this or not doing this, my understanding is that the board asked us to formulate this language. We've included it now for your presentation, but if there are additional steps and points of caution that you want us to research, I'm certainly open to that.
The board's decision to grant a license is off of the CPI?
It is one component.
What's the other component?
Their passage of the national exam, the background check that they've experienced in the state of California that's fingerprint-based, and then the essential application questions and the things that they've indicated in their application are all an amalgam to that decision.
And the CLE?
Absolutely, and the passage of the California law examination.
But coming from the supervising physical therapist, it is just the CPI document that you're looking at?
Correct.
And what is the criteria for passing?
They're essentially indicating passage in each category, that on that continuum, that they're vouching for that person, that they're competent and ready.
So at what point on that continuum do you say that they're not, they aren't meeting the mark? What is the score that the board has set for that?
It's not necessarily a score. It is either competent or not.
But on that continuum, there's beginner, advanced beginner, intermediate, advanced intermediate, and entry level and beyond entry level. So
Right,
what
everything
what's
at
the
entry
board looking
level
at?
or higher.
Entry level or higher on every single category?
Absolutely.
Jason, you bring up an interesting point for me, without naming names, but so there, in past, there has been a discrepancy between the narrative and the sort of the Likert scale, so that you have to seek clarification from. So in my mind, I think that those folks are actually using the tool in the spirit in which it was intended.
I do
be
too.
A guide and not the law, right? Not the
Absolutely.
litmus test. So I don't know that much about the PET, but does the PET also, it's sort of a yes-no, but it also allows for narrative?
It does. And just to kind of explain our concerns or our difficulties in the past with some of those issues where the information is conflicting with what's indicated in the continuum. As an example, all of the continuum indicators say entry level or higher, but there are comments in that specific category that are alarming, that speak to that candidate's abilities and those kind of things. That causes us to kind of say, we need to get further clarification. It doesn't always prohibit or stop that person from moving forward in the process. Very rarely, it actually getting that clarification back. And so I understand your point, and I concur. I think it does speak to the spirit of the idea, because essentially that clinical instructor is vouching for that person, regardless of what that comment might say. They're still saying, but they are entry level. Yes, I've focused in on this one particular problem, but they are entry level in my opinion, and then we can move forward with it. But it does lack that definitive nature that the PET provides.
Unfortunately, I can talk about this forever. Okay, so,
But in readdressing the board's concerns, I think if it's something that you wanted us to look into, the idea of maybe a sunset regulation or a temporary period of time or something like that, we're certainly apt to do that research.
can I ask another question, please? Looks like under D, the very last sentence, or the last few sentences, the certification shall include 2 evaluations of the physical therapist license applicant's skills. 1 evaluation shall determine the skill level midway through the period of clinical service, and the other evaluation shall determine the skill level at the end of the clinical service. Both evaluations shall be reported at the end of the period of clinical service. What's the purpose of that?
Midterm and final.
But
why the
why
end?
is it coming to the board only at the end? Why are we requiring it twice, but we only want to see it at the end?
I think there's still, as Dr. Drummer has said, there is that value of midterm and final, and we want to see insight into that period of clinical study. There's also a potential that it could have transferred from one supervising physical therapist to another. But why at the end? I would not want the applications incomplete to be submitted. We really do want to be involved in this after those things have already taken place. Having to look at the midway point without seeing the end is of no use to us, really.
Okay, so this is for the benefit of the applicant. Okay. And also the supervising physical
But
therapist.
we in our assessment, will look at both the midterm and the final.
Okay. Yes.
And what it suggests to me is kind of allows the board the ability to see the progress over time. So perhaps they were good and they got worse, or they were worse and they got better. You can see that progress without necessarily getting the application in parts, is my sense of this
Absolutely.
language.
That makes sense. Mr. Watkins?
Well, Jason, when you mentioned the definitive nature of the PET, you see, I'm making distinctions here.
Mhm.
That means that it is closest to being a decision tool,
Mhm.
and that means that it narrows the scope way much for anyone at the end, the board ultimately to make a decision. You see, because that's interesting, because when Florence,
Flores?
Flores,
Flores.
Flores was talking, he was talking about that it is used as a tool in a process now, and that it is no longer a decision tool. That you use the tool in the process to ultimately arrive at the decision. That's a big distinction right there.
But I don't want to leave you with the misconception. Both the intent expressed by APTA and the use of the CPEI is to provide it as a tool, but the initial decision whether or not to grant a license is that of the boards.
Yes.
And that is the intent of the FSBPT tool as well. And the reason I want to highlight that is there is always a room for discretion at the board level to interpret any part of that process as either a ruling out or a ruling in. And so, and the reason I say that is there may have been times where the tool says that the person is not ready, but there's other mitigating circumstances that indicate to the board that they are. And so we're not, we're going to use our discretion at that point and say, regardless of what the tool says, and that maybe one particular clinical instructor has said they're not minimally competent, we have other reason to believe they are, a license could be issued, because ultimately the decision is that of the jurisdiction and not the author of the tool. And then vice versa, the tool could indicate that they are minimally competent, but we also have reason to believe that there's other information that indicates that they're not. That even though that tool is submitted, that doesn't necessarily mean it guarantees that they're going to receive a license from that jurisdiction, because we're going to take the application process in its entirety into consideration of whether or not they're warranted for license.
Yeah, that's what I meant, is that, in the decision, that discretionary part, that is the subjective part
Absolutely.
of the decision. If that is this big, the tool is it's a process tool. But if that discretion is it's much closer, because the actual tool, it moves closer to what we call a decision tool. You see?
Sure.
And that's what I meant when I was talking about it being more a decision tool,
And-
with more accurate language. That's pretty significant for me in looking at the PED.
Yeah. And in comparison between the two tools, while I've indicated, that as being kind of a difficulty for us sometimes to interpret, by no means do I think that I might not, and staff may not, have that same situation with the Federation tool. I think by its design it would happen less frequently because of its definitive nature. But there's certainly still room that we might find information in the notes section of the FSBPT tool that in our review causes us to have concern and have to open a dialogue back with that clinical instructor for clarification.
Thank you.
So my last comment for now is one that we've brought up before, but one that I'm starting to feel even more strongly about as time goes by, and that is we do not require clinical instructors in the state of California for CAPTE graduates to be credentialed.
Can I make one
Yes, you may.
point of clarification?
Yes, you may.
So the president brings up a very good point. A good portion of what we're trying to do in the foreign educated application process is to try as best we can to create an equivalency. And I think the point that Dr. R.A. is trying to make is that maybe in my own experience, in my own sense of naivete, I assumed that all CAPTE clinical instructors were APTA approved, because we're drawing that requirement. And it may be more important to draw that requirement for foreign than it is maybe in a CAPTE accredited program. But I would differentiate, and I would say we don't necessarily have insight into what happens in the CAPTE accredited program, because we have that defer authority to CAPTE in their programs. It's actually CAPTE that would be requiring them to be APTA certified or not. Right? And so we wouldn't have insight to that, because that process is absolutely completed before they come to us as an applicant. And so we're assuming sometimes that those things are there.
So the board would never say, in order for a physical therapist to mentor a student from a CAPTE program, they would need to be credentialed, a credentialed CI.
I wouldn't go so far as the board could never say. You always could. I think it would require a statutory change, one, and two, a very lengthy conversation with the CAPTE folks, to talk about that idea, because my understanding is maybe some of the leniencies that are being applied to who can serve as a CI in the CAPTE system or not has a lot to do with market and demand. There's quite a shortage of sites and clinical instructors for all of the graduating classes, and so that would be one more thing that you would be putting in to say, if they're going to serve as a clinical instructor, they have to be APTA certified.
Yeah. So my point is that we do not require, or clinical instructors are not required right now to be credentialed. I see Dr. Drummer ready to talk. But we are requiring that of our foreign educated applicants. So we are putting an extra requirement on foreign educated trained PTs.
No, I would disagree.
Okay.
I would strongly disagree with that kind of a statement, because it's the CAPTE accredited education program. It's the physical therapist education or physical therapist assistant accredited program that is responsible for making sure that the student, the new graduate, has been adequately trained and has designated, no matter what facility they might have gone to for their clinical experiences. It's the school that is the education program that's taking the responsibility and saying that this individual is ready for application. In the case of a foreign trained applicant, we don't have that same level of confidence in what their training has been. And so this regulation helps us to ensure, by making sure that the CAPTE or that the APTA credentialed clinical instructor has at least some experience with what credentialing, with what clinical instruction aspects are required for CAPTE programs, for CAPTE accredited graduates, that there's a similarity, that there's equivalence, thank you, between what their background is and what we're saying their evaluation is comparing. There's a difference, and it's not the clinical instructor for a student who is providing a score or saying that the student passes. That's been in my mind, has been held as something for the clinical instructors thinking that they're passing a student or not passing a student. Mm-hmm. It's actually the school that's making the determination about whether or not the student passes based on the evaluation of the clinical experience as provided by the clinical instructor. Whether that clinical instructor is credentialed or not it's dependent on the school to make the determination if that student has met the requirements and has satisfied that. In the foreign trained applicant, we don't have that luxury of having the school taking that responsibility, because they've already gone through that program and we don't have that information. And so we rely on the credentialed clinical instructor's opinion.
Okay.
And if I could just add to that, the only thing I would just caution in the use of the words extra requirement, only because, and it may be semantic, but again, to kind of echo what Dr. Drummer is saying, because we're not the ones applying those requirements to the CAPTE because of the deferral, and we're also relying on them as an institution and making that decision of whether or not they've graduated from the educational portion of the program, it's not necessarily an extra requirement, it's just a requirement.
Okay.
Right? I mean, it's not, we can all identify that there's some inconsistencies, but there may be reasons to have those inconsistencies, but it's not an addition, it's a completely separate system.
So I can take CAPTE out of it and ask, what data do we have that shows that credentialed CIs do any better of a job supervising our foreign educated applicants than someone who's not credentialed?
That information I cannot give you. I don't have any
So what's our
statistical
justification
information
for it?
I think, and it kind of speaks to what Dr. Drummer was saying before, is that we have no insight into the foreign education they received in their mother country before they came to the U.S., whether there was a clinical service period or whether there wasn't, or any insight as to what that looks like. We know now, over the decades of this process, that there are now foreign schools that are actually using supervised clinical practices, and we see those showing up in the coursework tools and those kind of things. But until we can reach a point of standardization that we can rely on at that point, we've imposed a supervised clinical practice requirement, and then having to utilize a tool that we can rely on that most closely resembles the general system that we rely on from CAPTE, but we know that there's going to be a difference. And I also think that there's an additional point of review here because they're foreign trained and there's differences in the healthcare systems from the country they come from and here. That's also something that we're also trying to kind of discern and fetter out. And so that's the one, I think, benefit that we're looking at when we look at the difference between the CPEI and the PET.
Thank you. Yes.
I have the PET open in front of you now. There's one sentence actually that's bolded. I was trying to see if maybe Jason, does FSBPT offer training in the use of the PET?
They do. It's an online course training that they provide. So I don't think that they have any in-person training that I'm aware of, but they do have both online tutorial process where you can go at your own pace, but I think they've also done webcasts in the past with group setting.
Yeah. The sentence in particular that's bolded, supervisor should follow the scoring instruction exactly in order to maintain the validity and reliability of the tool. Pretty strong statement.
And
that's their attempt.
The training guide that they're speaking of is pretty extensive that comes with it in printed form.
So this board likes to discuss and deliberate, but we also really value public comment. And so I'd like to invite public comment regarding this topic. If anyone has anything to add or any thoughts about what we've been discussing, if anyone wants to come forward. Yes, please come forward to the microphone and introduce yourself. Yeah, please.
Yeah, my name is Mark Berner. I work at the VA, and I'm a patient advocate. I'm also a veteran. And I...
Mark?
Yes.
We're going to talk later.
Oh.
Yeah,
that
it's about this subject.
That is a different subject. Oh, okay. Wrong one.
Yeah, all right. Sorry about the confusion.
That's okay. So Mark, your comment was not about foreign educated physical therapy? Okay, yeah, so I think that's next up on the doc. But does anyone else have any public comment about this that could be useful for the board? No? Okay. Further board discussion, yeah?
In the hopes of pulling a motion out of you, would you like staff to go back and research the idea of a regulation that has a sunset period to collect data?
Can we take a straw poll on that? Jesus, Dr. Dominguez? Yeah. Yes? Dr. Drummer?
As the presenter of the interesting thought, yes.
I half expected you to say no.
I know, me too. Me too. Ms. Ellaby?
I would be happy to move forward with a motion today. I'm comfortable with the tool, and I think we vetted it extensively. And I'm confident that using a tool that's designed for evaluating foreign educated is better than using a tool that has not been designed for that.
Mr. Watkins?
And I'll go with that too. And since Jason and we ultimately have the option of saying if it doesn't work, we can just pull it downstream. I think that would probably be a cleaner way of doing it. So to proceed with the current.
Yes, thank you. And I also feel like we can move forward today, although it just still doesn't sit well with me to require the supervising physical therapist to be CI credentialed. That's my straw poll. So any further public comment? Any motion? Anyone want to make a motion?
I move we adopt the proposed language for this foreign educated applicants with the amendments that you suggested, Alicia, about the consistency of naming the clinical instructor as well as the physical therapist license applicant.
And I'll second that.
And grant the executive officer the authority to make non-substantive changes and utilize our legal.
So I can propose motion language for this motion.
Thank you.
So approve the proposed regulatory text for title, Article, Section 1398.26.5 in Article 2, Division 13.2 of Title 16 of the California Code of Regulations. Direct staff to submit the proposed text to the Director of the Department of Consumer Affairs and the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency for review, and if no adverse comments are received, authorize the executive officer to take all steps necessary to initiate the rulemaking process, make any non-substantive changes to the package, and set the matter for hearing.
So moved,
And
as amended.
upon the executive officer's inclusion of those additional consistency edits described by the board.
So we have a motion by Ms. Ellaby and a second by Mr. Watkins. Any further board discussion? And any public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benaman,
No.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
No.
Katarina Ellaby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian is absent. So we've got 3 ayes and 2 noes. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Madam President, maybe a recommendation. If we could readdress agenda item number 7,
Yes,
the
please.
Consumer Professional Association's reports. We have a representative from the California Physical Therapy Association in the audience. Ms. Defoe, if you'd like to.
Yes, please. Good morning.
Good morning. Still morning, right? I'm Stacy Defoe from California Physical Therapy Association, and don't have a whole lot to report at this point. We are gearing up for our annual conference that'll take place next week, Friday and Saturday, in Santa Clara, and we hope to see, and we're glad the board is participating and will be available to our members in the exhibit hall, and we're always thankful for that, and hope to see more of you there as well. And I think I missed the legislative update portion this morning. So I'm sure that you've gone over all the updates, but just wanted to say thank you to the board for submitting your letter of support regarding AB 2423, and it did pass all the committees in the houses and is currently sitting on the governor's desk. Haven't heard anything yet as to that, but thank you for your support there. And then also for agreeing to submit your opposed unless amended letter regarding the OT, not the the AT bill this year. And as you probably were already updated, that bill ended up in Senate Appropriations, didn't get out this year, but we know that this issue will come back again until it's resolved in some way. So again, just thank you for your support and your interest in that issue as well. That's all I have for now, unless you have any questions of us.
Stacey, I just wanted to clarify. I think I heard you say next Friday and Saturday for the conference, but I believe conference is Saturday and Sunday?
Correct.
Oh, I was nervous for a second there.
Sorry.
I was like, I didn't take the day off.
No, our Assembly of Representatives meeting is Friday, and the conference is actually Saturday and Sunday. Thank you for the clarification.
I'm also glad for that.
Okay, sorry. Did I raise some blood pressure there? No, that's all.
Yes. Okay, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Yes. And so I think we are going to take a recess, a short recess, and maybe that'll give us time to set up the room for the next presentation that's coming up. So it is 11:50 right now. Can we please be back and ready to go right at 11? Thank you. We're back on record. It's 11:02, and we are going to move to agenda item number 18. And before so, we'll have a statement from our legal counsel.
So, as the board knows, I also represent the Acupuncture Board of California, as well as my representation of the Physical Therapy Board of California. So I just wanted to disclose that at the outset of this presentation. While this presentation doesn't indicate that there's going to be, discussion or board action, that it's a presentation, there may be questions and a little bit of discussion involved on that. If the issue of scope of practice regarding acupuncture or physical therapy comes up, I will be recusing myself from that issue at this time from providing legal advice until such time as we can find alternate legal representation for either the acupuncture board or the physical therapy board so that there is no conflict with myself providing advice to both boards on that legal issue of scope of practice.
Thank you.
And in an effort to avoid any kind of controversy or confusion, I'll just make a statement to say the current state of affairs for physical therapists in the state of California today is dry needling is explicitly prohibited as a result of the medical statutes that say a physician or a surgeon can penetrate tissue. No other practitioner can unless it's explicitly stated in their scope of practice. And having said that, because it's not explicitly stated in our scope of practice for physical therapists, is why my PTs cannot and shall not use dry needling modalities within the jurisdiction of California. We have very limited scope when it comes to tissue penetration, specifically for electroneuromyography or kinesiological neuromyography, and that's it. So any change in that would require legislative change. It wouldn't be something that the board could do on their own. We would rely on those assemblymen and senators to author a bill that would create that kind of change. So just that clarification.
Thank you, Mr. Heiser. So we will move out into the audience, and I'll have the presenters take over and introduce yourselves.
Is that clear enough for everyone to see? I don't know if it's like a. Is there any possible way to change the coloring?
The connection. We might have to connect it. Because yesterday was yellow.
Yeah. Just a minute for technical difficulties.
No problem.
Switch it to presentation.
Yeah. What was that one?
That's better.
With the blue and yellow.
So around here, you just get to choose between colors.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thank you very much. My name is Teo Dionelis. I'm the Director of Rehabilitation Services at the Palo Alto VA Healthcare System. On behalf of my colleagues, we'd like to thank the board for inviting us out here today to share our experiences and practices with the use of therapeutic dry needling in our healthcare system with our veterans. We also refer to as TDN throughout the presentation. So with me today is our Chief of Physical Therapy Services, Dr. Jerome Sabagan. And next to him is Dr. Russell Bishop, physical therapist, orthopedic clinical specialist, and he's our lead TDN certifier in our healthcare system. Next to him is our lead spinal cord physical therapist, Richard Castillo is also our CCCE within the Palo Alto healthcare system. And next to him is Tony Trauma. He's a physical therapist here now at the Mather VA. He was one station over in the Marina in our healthcare system and moved up north a little bit. So thank you for your time to come out as well. And with that, we're going to go into our presentation.
Just step back
Oh, there we go.
just a little bit, please.
No problem. So the goal for us today when we came out is we just want to educate and just provide some information from our experience as practitioners using this modality. So some of the key objectives we're going to go over throughout this presentation to myself and my colleagues is listed here. We just want to provide an understanding to the PT board of the history of how we came about using it within the Department of the VA and more of a broader sense of just the history of dry needling in general in the physical therapy practice, as well as we kind of define, discuss what is a trigger point. So as a constituents of California come to you guys, you might have a better understanding of what are we talking about when we talk about trigger points. What does that mean? And how does it contribute to what we treat as physical therapists is myofascial pain. And also we want to present some current evidence of why we utilize this, what evidence and research kind of gives us the knowledge and abilities to provide this to our veterans and our healthcare system. Why is it safe? Why is it beneficial? What's the evidence supporting that? And what's the training that us as physical therapists have to provide a safe training to our veterans in our healthcare setting? Is it not just simply we decide to use this treatment? What does the research show that provide us the knowledge and capability to do this? And fortunately, we have some veterans that wanted to come in today to kind of share their experiences with us treating them. And in the healthcare system, they wanted to come out and talk to the board about their situation when we came to treat them. So we're going to go over that today. And so briefly, some background into the VA system of why we went about using it is, so the mission of the Department of Veterans Affairs is pretty simple. Is our goal is to uphold President Abraham Lincoln's promise to veterans, is that we are here to serve those who have borne the battle and of the widows and of their orphans. And we do that every day by serving the men and women of the military veterans. And so we base all of our guidelines of practice behind that notion that we're here to serve those who have served us. And so more so at the Department of VA Apollo Healthcare System, it is our mission to be the clinical benchmark and excellence in care. So every day we know that healthcare continues to evolve and new practices come available through different modalities and treatments. So we try to stay up to date with the current evidence and research. And lo and behold, we have an opportunity where this new modality came about when we started partnering more closely with our partners in the Department of Defense. So we try to stay very close in relation because active military soldiers who go through the DoD will soon become our patients in Veterans Affairs. So we try to keep a close working relationship with best practices that they use so that when they come through our doors, that there's no gap in care between what they can receive when they're out in theater or on base and or campus with them and through our doors. And so a few years back, we noticed that there was a gap in care. There were some active duty military soldiers that come through our doors because we have certain specialty programs that we still get active duty members that we treat on a daily basis. And then we had some active duty military PTs that transitioned from working in DoD. Now in the VA, noticed that we don't offer dry needling in our doors. We were able to use on the front line in theater with our active duty soldiers on the front line. And then when we started coming to the VA, they noticed in California, why don't you guys offer this? And we started working with them and collaborating and looking at their competencies and practices and how they use it in theater with their active duty soldiers. And so we adopted that best practice model into our model system so we can offer that same streamline of care. And so the DoD shared with us is that they found that this intervention has been so beneficial to their soldiers that they're now looking to deploy active duty PTs to the front line in theater because from a military standpoint, the DoD, a soldier who has back pain, who becomes on opioids or heavy pain medication isn't fit for duty, so they get held back when deployments happen. And when they can't deploy a soldier to the front line, that's less soldiers in the battle. So they found that utilizing treatments such as dry needling can help minimize the use of opioids and use on the front line. They can treat on a non-pharmacological approach so that they can keep their soldiers fit for duty or mission ready, as they call it. So when we started adapting that, we're starting to find some similar results of best practices. And so we modeled our streamlined best practice of care to keep mission-ready soldiers within their system and also post-career of our vets. Because we have similar guidelines that we want to provide safe treatments, because when vets come to us, they might not be active duty anymore, but they still have goals in life. They still want to be functional, to be able to go back to school, to go back to work, to go back with their families. And it's those goals that are vital to them that they want to come to us to get the best quality care. So we wanted to offer that with our soldiers and veterans that come to us. So with that, we adopted dry needling into our best care practice, and now we utilize that across our healthcare system in California. And so transitioning that, we're just going to go a little bit step back and go through what is trigger point dry needling. I'm going to pass the mic over to our Dr. Bishop to go over that. This one goes forward, double click, and then.
So my name is Rusty Bishop, and so a little background about myself. So I was trained in dry needling in the Air Force, so I was an active duty physical therapist almost 7 years ago. And so the Air Force trained me to do dry needling. And when I first learned dry needling in the Air Force, it was a special scope of practice. Within 2 years, it became a regular competency for therapists who are active duty to be able to do this skill. So it's not just a special skill to be able to do, it's a competency in the Air Force, in the Army, and I'm almost certain in the Navy as well. So I was very fortunate when I was trained to do dry needling. They also trained me to do advanced dry needling, and I was sent out on multiple sessions going to San Antonio to look at cadavers, spend over 10 days at a time learning advanced dry needling techniques. We'd actually dry needle cadavers, and then we'd learn some advanced manual therapy skills and medical screening. Also, because I've practiced in the direct access setting, I currently am an adjunct faculty at Samuel Merritt, where I teach medical screening, differential diagnosis, and then I also teach with the grade 5 or high velocity thrust techniques. So I work in the academic realm as well. So my job here is to kind of go more through like the nuts and bolts of dry needling, kind of understanding what we're basing this off of, what it is, and then I do have one case I want to present where I kind of go through how I utilize it in my practice. So dry needling. So to the layman, dry needling is the use of a very thin needle that we penetrate the skin, and essentially we try to go into knots within the muscle, which could be causing pain in that area or over a greater area. Okay. So when we look at what trigger points are in the research, the definition is a highly localized and hyper-irritable spot in a palpable top band of skeletal muscle fibers. So if generally most people have felt knots who are not physical therapists, right? So most people think of knots like I have a knot in my neck. They're able to feel that. There's a lot of research supporting the actual physiological changes within these aspects of the muscle. One thing to understand when we look at actual trigger points is the difference between an active and a latent trigger point. So let's back up just a little bit. So if I'm doing an examination on someone and I'm palpating tissue and I'm snapping over a band and that's causing pain, that's a trigger point. So what we have to understand is that there are different types of trigger points. So an active trigger point could be causing that patient pain without any sort of provocation. So I could have a knot or a trigger point in, let's say, my rotator cuff that could be causing me pain right now without any sort of provocation. Now, also those trigger points, an active trigger point, they have referral patterns. So let's say that the referral pattern of that one in the rotator cuff goes down my arm. So I could be sitting here right now with arm pain that's actually stemming from a trigger point. And an active trigger point, when I push on that knot or that band, when I snap over it, the patient says, not only does it hurt there, but it starts to refer somewhere else. And then when I let go of that knot, they say it still hurts. Versus what's called a latent trigger point, when I push on that knot or I snap over that band, it hurts, and then I let go, and the pain goes away. So that's really important to understand because we actually know there are physiological changes, differences between active and latent trigger points. And one thing also to understand about trigger points is generally we think of these as spots that are more superficial that we can feel. But what we know is there are trigger points in all muscles, so even deep muscles. So deep muscles in our hip, in our spine. So those can be a little bit tougher to feel. And so with those, you have to push really hard to try to actually try to get the pain to go. So it's really important to understand that with trigger points that they could be more superficial or they could actually be deeper. There are 6 characteristics of a myofascial trigger point. So compression may elicit either local or referred pain. Snapping over them could cause what's called a localized twitch response. So that's where the muscle will actually involuntarily twitch. It'll feel like a quick Charlie horse and then it will release. And we'll talk about more about that later in a couple slides forward. We know that trigger points can actually restrict range of motion. So I could have a trigger point in my upper trapezius or my neck muscle. And when I bend to the right, it could feel like a really sensitive, like it's really pulling on that side. And that could be stemming from a trigger point. So we also know that trigger points can actually cause weakness within muscle. So quite often in my practice, I might test the rotator cuff strength, and that might be painful and weak. And then I treat that trigger point, and then they're strong and painless. So we know it can affect strength. Number 5 is more, we'll go into this one in the next slide. And then we also know, again, active trigger points can cause spontaneous pain versus latent where you just have to push on them to cause the pain. So there's a lot of evidence that we have that we look at the physiological changes within the environment of the trigger points or that muscle that are different from the surrounding tissue. I'm not going to go through each of these, but what I want you to understand is we have quantifiable measures of within the neuromuscular junction of these trigger points that it's different from, again, that surrounding tissue source. So this is something that we can quantifiably measure, as well as we can actually image this as well through an MRE. So here's a couple, this is a diagram of a couple kind of classic trigger points. And what you'll see is, so if we go to the one to the right, in the shoulder blade there, you see that the spots are in the muscles that's where your infraspinatus or one of your rotator cuff muscles lies, but it actually could cause pain down your arm. The same for the bottom left in the hip. That's your gluteus minimus, so that's the deepest hip muscle, and that could actually cause what looks like almost like a sciatic-like symptom. So this is really important as a physical therapist and as an instructor in differential diagnosis. We see a lot of patients who have referred pain. And so it's really important to understand that this pain could be coming from a nerve in your neck or your back, but it also could be stemming from a muscle. And it's very easy to tell because if I push on that muscle and it causes that referred pain, then I have a high likelihood that it's coming from the muscle. And what's also really important to understand with this is those are not the points that I would just go to. I don't look at a manual and say, oh, the point is right there, so I'm going to do that on that person. I'm feeling that muscle to figure out where those knots are to actually penetrate that spot. So it's really important because to understand that I don't use this as a map of where do I go. My map is where my hands go and where I'm actually able to push on that spot. They feel the pain. Boom, that's where I'm going. So we currently know there are different ways to address myofascial trigger points. So I'm going to more focus on the invasive ways. So, one thing to kind of plug in is think about who's doing this, their education background, and their training. So if we think about PAs, nurse practitioners, general physicians, and beyond, who are doing local anesthetic injections, steroid injection, Botox injections, as well as dry needling to treat myofascial trigger points. So now we're getting into the actual dry needling portion. So what is dry needling? Dry needling is essentially, we described the kind of layman term, but it's called dry because we're not injecting any sort of wet substance through the needle. Our intent is to affect the neuromuscular junction because that's where we know the physiological abnormalities are. And we know that when we treat those, that there is actually physiological changes that we can measure afterwards. Our goal with this technique is to elicit what's called a localized twitch response. So what we're trying to elicit is that muscle to involuntarily contract and release. And again, we know that when we get that, when they looked at the electrical activity of that muscle, it was very hyperactive before, and you get that localized twitch response, and it goes down immediately. So again, we have physiological measures that before and after this treatment within those neuromuscular junctions. So a little history. So myofascial components of pain have been looked at for hundreds of years. More recently, Dr. Travell and Dr. Simons published a book, Myofascial Pain and Dysfunction, where they look at the trigger points, those knots, and their common referral patterns, even though the referral patterns can differ depending on the patient. So one thing to understand is the way trigger points were initially treated was through local anesthetic injections. So that's how this was started, how you treat myofascial trigger points. So one thing what happened in 1979, Karl Lewitt, as a Czech Republic doctor, he did a research study. And what he did is he had over 200 patients, and he wanted to see the effects of local anesthetic injections on these myofascial trigger points. So he did injections, and then he also had a control group. The control group was no injection, the dry needle. And so what he found was that there was no difference between the injection and the dry needle. And so he deemed it dry needling. So that's how dry needling came about, was actually through local anesthetic injections, which then progressed to dry needling. And that's one thing to understand is this all started with a hypodermic needle. So that's a hypodermic needle is a hollow needle where you inject substance through. So even Dr. Travell, who progressed from anesthetic injections to dry needling, still used a hypodermic needle to perform dry needling. We progressed to a solid filament needle, which is not hollow. It's very thin. One, because it's more comfortable for the patients because it's thinner, so it's less painful. But there's still up to debate which tool is better, a hypodermic needle or a solid filament needle. I think that's really important to understand because anytime needles get involved, it's trying to understand where our progression came from when we're treating myofascial trigger points and how we develop dry needling. So here are just some of the physiological effects after dry needling that we have science to back up. I'm just going to go through a couple contraindications to dry needling. So some absolute ones are any sort of local infection, any sort of needle phobia, if they're unable to provide consent. Relative contraindications are any sort of bleeding disorders, vascular disorders, diabetes because of sensation changes, pregnancy in the first trimester, any sort of joint replacement, and then we don't dry needle in the exact region of a postoperative for 12 weeks or in the region for 8 weeks. That's because we don't want to introduce any sort of infection. All right, so all the fun stuff. We actually have a patient case. I present this to Samuel Merritt University. I've done it for 4 years. And when I first did it, I asked it, raise your hand if you've heard of dry needling, and there wasn't a hand that raised. That was 4 years ago. Last year, I asked the same question. Everyone raised their hand, and many people in the class actually experienced it in other states. So it's kind of amazing how fast this is progressed. And also, when I presented it, I always present it as the technique. But the biggest thing you have to understand with dry needling is it's a tool as a physical therapist, and we use it as a physical therapist. And I think it's important. So that's why I wanted to plug in a case to understand how we utilize it within our practice. So I'm going to try to summarize this a little bit. So I had this is a patient, a very recent patient, 77-year-old male, 2 months of left low back pain down his leg. He has some weakness in his ankle. He has a difficult time walking for 5 to 10 minutes because of pain. He has difficulty sleeping at night because of pain. He also has difficulty sitting because he has this pinching in the front of his hip, his left hip. He's on these medications. And also, 4 weeks before I saw him, he had an epidural injection, which lasted for 2 days, and then the pain came back. So this patient is one step away from spinal surgery. So he comes to see me. He's really not expecting too much. What can I do? I'm a physical therapist. He's already had an injection. Here's a body chart of his pain. So just to, real quick, you can see left low back, kind of a constant 4 out of 10. He has intermittent weakness in his left front lower leg with walking, and then that kind of pinching in his left front hip. I'm not going to go through all this, but the biggest thing in my examination findings, or the biggest point I want to make with this is I did a very thorough musculoskeletal evaluation. I didn't list everything there, but as a practicing physical therapist, it's very important that I first analyze this patient's movement dysfunction, and I'm basing everything off of what he's not able to do functionally, and I want to figure out why functionally he's not able to do that. So I went through range of motion, palpation, and again, I didn't list everything, just kind of the more of the relevant things here. So just, again, I won't go through everything here. So treatment, what did I do from the very first day? I did a dry needling treatment to a couple areas. So the T12L1, that's kind of the upper mid back, and then the low back, and then to the side of his sacroiliac joint, and then to the front of his hip. So why did I choose those spots? So when I was palpating, when I was looking at his accessory motion of his spine, I go to the side and I assess the muscles. So what I'm feeling for is along the spine, I'm feeling for any, we call them kind of like speed bumps, because those could potentially be trigger points. So then I push very hard on those spots to see if I can elicit any sort of active symptoms that are going anywhere else besides that spot. So in those first 3 spots, I went to the spot, the T12L1 up here, and he said, wow, you know, that's going down. He didn't, I don't know if he said wow, but he said, ow, that's going down my back. And then I went to the one in the low back, and he goes, that's causing the pain down my leg. And then to the front, to the side of his sacroiliac joint, he said, wow, you know, that's going to my hip. So I had 3 spots right there that I'm like, okay, these are active spots that he could potentially have some pain reduction, and maybe this is limiting some of his motion. The last spot I went to was the front of his hip, and that's the iliopsoas. And the reason I was looking at that is because what I noticed when he was walking, and I might go in front of the camera here, but when he was walking, he was slumped forward. He was kind of limping like this, and he didn't really have a lot of what we call hip extension from his left hip. So his left hip wasn't really extending behind him. So as a physical therapist, I'm thinking, why is that happening? So I go to the front of his hip, his iliopsoas, and he's really tender there. And I'm thinking potentially that muscle could be causing some resistance, so he's not able to get into that position. So I treated, and the treatment took overall 10 minutes. 5 of the minutes was me doing the informed consent. And the rest of it was the treatment and getting him set in the position. And so the first, I spent about probably 10 seconds in each spot. And then I flipped him over, and I did the front spot again, 10 seconds. That's all it is. When I'm doing that treatment, I'm going in with the needle, and I'm trying to provoke that localized twitch response. And then I'm done. I take out the needle, and I move to the next spot. And what I do to see if I made an effect is I push right back on that spot as hard as I did before. And what patients say is, one is they don't have the symptoms going down their back, and they'll say it feels more sore than sharp. That's how I know I've made an effect. So I have a progression of how I know if they're going to respond well. And so I did that to each of those spots. And just as a kind of an expected response for most patients that we say is you might expect some soreness. I'm like going into my normal ramble. I talk to patients. You might expect soreness. You might expect you might have some bruising. I probably in 6 years had maybe 2 people actually bruise. Very rare, even on blood thinners. Occasional sympathetic response. Again, maybe 1 or 2 people. Very, very rare. And then But what I expect in that same session is a change immediately. I expect a change in their pain. I expect a change in their range of motion or strength. So this is not something I'm waiting to get a change. It's right away I'm expecting a change. So here's his response. So when he walked, he had increased rotation, increased left hip extension. This is what he said. He said, feels like I can now push off my left leg. His range of motion, his lumbar spine improved dramatically. His hip extension normalized to what it was on the other side, and he had a negative straight leg raise. So a pretty dramatic response on his function, just, again, 5-minute treatment. But what does that matter? It's within the session. We have to see what is he going to do when he comes back. So that's great. I made a change, but within my physical therapy knowledge, now I gave him specific exercises and stretches to solidify that change. So I gained hip extension range of motion, so I gave him a stretch to keep that. I gained motion in his low back going down, so I gave him a stretch to keep that. And then I worked on his gait mechanics. So we worked on his ability to stand up straight, get a little bit of rotation. So we worked on the things that he had difficulty with. So second visit, he comes back, he's able to walk 20 minutes, and this is a week later, walk 20 minutes, he's able to sit without pain, he had 0 out of 10 low back pain, he still had some weakness in his lower front ankle, but he was also able to sleep without pain. And that's after he had epidural injection. He's had this pain for 2 months, he's expecting to have surgery. And so I wanted to give this case one is to look at holistically how I use that technique and that tool within the practice of physical therapy, because again, it is a tool and a technique that is utilized within all the musculoskeletal knowledge that I've gained through school, and as well as how I examine that individual. And so I don't think I would have been able to do this without that tool, that dry needling tool. And what I can tell you in my experience of doing this for 6 years is I've saved I've saved a lot of patients from steroid injections, excessive opioid uses, surgeries, because in our population, a lot of patients even go to a lot of people before they get to us in physical therapy. And if they have, they come to you and they've done everything else. And they're sitting there thinking, what are you going to do for me? You're a physical therapist. You know, am I going to do some stretches or some exercises? I've had pain for so long. But now I have this tool that I can make an immediate effect on their pain and their function. And that is huge in our patient population. And it's, again, like I said, and as the consumers I've treated, which is active duty and veterans, it's been just amazing to be able to provide that to my patients. And so the last thought here is just, again, this is not a standalone treatment. We're utilizing this with all of our bread and butter type things: manual therapy, therapeutic exercise, neuro-re-ed, education, all these things. It's an adjunct to all these elements that we already know. I think that's it on my part. All right, so I'm going to pass it on. Yeah. Oh, so my understanding of your question is, if I didn't have the use of dry needling, what would I have done in replace of that? So, and obviously that answer is going to vary tremendously who you talk to. I have a lot of training in manual therapy techniques, using high velocity techniques. I would probably have gone to the areas that were most restricted within his spine. And I would have done either some I would have done some mobilizations, either in side lying or in prone, to get those specific spots moving better, those joints, as well as those muscles the best I could, especially now knowing the power that active trigger points have. I would try to treat those manually. And I did go 9 months in the VA without being able to use dry needling. So I've been through that. And it took me a lot longer to get people better. And some people I wasn't able to get the buy-in I was able to get. Because if you're thinking about trying to treat a myofascial trigger point deep in your spine, very, very difficult. So I tend to probably go more to try to mobilize the joint. But you don't get that immediate effect as you do, especially if there's a lot of pain coming from the muscular component. I don't know if that answers your question very well. Yes. Yes.
That's what I'm getting.
For treating the active myofascial trigger points, especially that are deeper and hard to treat. Yeah. All right.
All right, I'm going to stand over this way since I have some notes over here. All right, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm pretty loud anyway. This is kind of my nature, so. Oh, okay. So hopefully it won't be too loud. All right. So I think one thing that everybody's really wondering is TDN safe, especially to be performed by physical therapists. So in 2014, there was a study from 4 different physical therapists from 3 different universities, and their goal was basically to find out the incidence of adverse effects in performing trigger point dry needling by physiotherapists. And this study was done in Ireland. All right, as you see here, there was a study of 39 physiotherapists over a 10-month period. And when it comes to adverse effects, they are split into 3 different categories: mild, significant, and severe. Mild is something that which is very in short duration, and it is reversible. Significant is something that could affect a person's function, and severe is one that is actually something that might require hospitalization. So the results and the big takeaway from this study was there were no significant adverse effects that were reported during this. Now, as you see here, you do see quite a few mild common adverse effects that they defined in this study. However, if you look at the common side effects here, mild bruising and bleeding, these are some common things that you might see after getting a vaccination or any type of shot or any type of injection. So when it comes to safety in trigger point dry needling versus medical management, these are some of the pharmacological agents that other providers use, especially physicians. So when it comes to non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, there's always an increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, GI bleeds, and all of these actually have a chance of having some type of risk or even side effects. When it comes to corticosteroid injections, we're looking at complications such as the cartilage damage, weakened tendons, bone death. Now, that's probably one of the reasons why it is recommended that you only get up to only four corticosteroid injections per year. One thing that Dr. Bishop was talking about is like how we use this in physical therapy, how we use it for pain, how we use it for to increase our range of motion, how we increase function. I work the neuro side. I actually work spinal cord injury, and something that we have seen when using this, and actually was something that we did not expect, that it actually helps decrease spasticity, at least transiently. One problem with, right now if you have a patient who has neurological dysfunction, they have increased tone or spasticity, one of the big things that they use now for that is Botox. The problem with Botox is a lot of times you have residual weakness that accompanies that. So let me go over a case. I had a patient. He's a Green Beret. He's former Delta Force operator. He actually had he actually had tumor that was surrounding his spinal cord around the mid-back area. But even after surgery, he still had a lot of lower extremity weakness, and he had a lot of tone. Tone meaning extra muscle activity that is very difficult to overcome, which can actually decrease or hinder your function. So we're noticing that he was having a lot of difficulty standing up, even with a walker, and he needed quite a bit of assistance when he was walking, because when he was walking, his legs would cross over because the amount of tone and spasticity that were causing his legs to come over, and he was bent over a lot. So his center of gravity was behind, causing him to fall backwards. So I spoke to his primary physician, and we decided to collaborate on this case because she was really afraid that if we gave him any Botox, that because he was coming out of the stages of recovery following his spinal cord injury, that it may impede his function. So we both decided, let's try trigger point dry needling, because he does have trigger points in those muscles that he has spasticity. So we did treat him. We treated his adductor magnus. We also treated his psoas muscles as well. So after the first treatment, he was actually able to stand with a front four-wheel walker with minimal assistance, not a lot of assistance. He was actually able to ambulate short distances with a four-wheel walker with just supervision, meaning that we didn't have to hold on to him anymore. So, that was for short periods of time, but what we have noticed that is they are short-lived effects. They may last about a week or so, but then we just continue to, we will follow up and treat that way. When it comes to pain also, we, physicians and providers also may prescribe opioids. But we know that they're in the United States and other countries across the world, that dependency, addiction, and abuse are huge. We know it's an epidemic. I think up to 70% of people who are prescribed opioids actually, or actually just any type of prescription drugs, 70% of them overdose from opioids. And there's also the economic burden. So you talk about things like court costs, loss of work, time lost at work because of abuse or abuse of the product. And how this ties into this is that using trigger point dry needling, we understand that these are some alternatives that we can use instead of some of these. Actually, the VA has started, I think it's I forgot the exact name, the opioid. It's a program where they're looking at alternative methods to treat pain other than opioids, and we're hoping that dry needling could be one of those. Okay, this study is actually comparing trigger point dry needling versus corticosteroid injections. As you can see here. Now, when they're actually doing a study when it comes to lateral hip pain or outside hip pain, which is better known, or people know as greater trochanteric pain syndrome. The results from this study, the big takeaway is that they found out cortisone injections to that area, they didn't provide any better relief to it, and they found out it was actually the mechanical stimulation of the needle itself that was responsible for the pain relief. It wasn't the injection itself. Here is a slide just of the risk of variations of interventions versus trigger point dry needling. And with the interventions you see here are different things that other healthcare providers actually use. So if you look at the risk and the potential complications, which can be pretty significant, there's a lot of risk in anything that we do. But the thing to know is that as physical therapists, we have a lot of education, and we are expertise when it comes, and when we're using this modality, we're using it, for the musculoskeletal dysfunctions that we see. And I think with that expertise that, I think we can decrease the amount of adverse effects that may come. Sir?
Yeah, I hate to ask.
Oh, I'm sorry. I grew up in Texas, so.
Just as you were speaking, when you use these steroid injections
Mm-hmm.
and the opiates,
Mm-hmm.
it is more of a masking agent. And from what I understood from the previous presenter was that this actually addresses the underlying cause.
That is correct. That's one thing that we've noticed. We also, for pain, even in physical therapy, we use electrical agents as well. And a lot of there's something we call what's called the H wave. And what it does, it really just kind of masks or slows down the pain for a while. But we use it for a lot of our veterans for chronic pain. But, they may use it for a few hours and they get a relief for a few hours. But then it always comes back. So it's not really addressing the actual cause of the pain. What my experience of dry needling, that we're actually addressing the actual point where the pain begins.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jerome Sabankin. I want to start off by saying hi to my wife and my kid, Simone. I'm on TV. I love you. And I should have listened to my wife. She told me to bring a jacket, but I said we're going to Sacramento. It's going to be hot, but I'm still freezing my butt off. All right. On that note, maybe some of you are wondering if PTs are actually educated or competent enough to perform dry needling. Which is understandable, right? So since 2010, jurisdictions have looked into the FS, Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy, regarding the ability of PTs to perform dry needling, and no studies were available during that time, all right? So in 2015, the FSBPT, they sponsored a practice analysis looking into this. And what they did was they hired an outside agency, a nonprofit social and behavioral science research and consulting firm that was dedicated to the measurement and improvement of human and organizational performance. Totally just reading that. And they chose them because they had the best understanding of the needs of what we were trying to look for, if PTs really had the competence and knowledge to perform this trigger point dry needling. Another thing I want to add is that they were an independent contractor, so they're able to carry out an objective analysis, unbiased analysis, okay? For this practice analysis, they drew from multiple sources of information. They looked at text, they did interviews, they interviewed dry needling experts, licensed PTs, and the process for developing or looking into these competencies, they included 3 main steps, all right? They looked at the background, they did a background review, they did a practitioner survey, and they also held a task force meeting. This task force meeting had experts, they had observers from the APTA, so it was really, really concentrated, like a knowledgeable group of people in this task force, all right? The task force's primary objective was to define dry needling, all right? We have to define it. I know it seems very simple because if you don't define it, you can't really investigate it, all right? The next thing they did was they defined the standards for competence. What is safe? What is effective? Okay? And then they reviewed and refined the tasks needed for dry needling, all right? and they reviewed and refined the knowledge requirements to perform dry needling. And lastly, they identified the skills and abilities to perform dry needling. Okay? The task force members, they were also charged with evaluating what extent entry-level knowledge, so knowledge required for licensure in physical therapy, is needed for safely and effectively using dry needling. Okay? And the next slide is what they found. They found through this in-depth analysis that 86% of the knowledge requirements needed to be competent in dry needling is acquired during the course of PT entry-level education. All right? And what they did find is that 14% of the knowledge requirements related to competency in dry needling must be acquired through postgraduate education or specialized training in dry needling. And this includes things that you wouldn't expect in a physical therapy program to begin with because it's not within the scope of practice, perhaps. It would be things like emergency preparedness or response procedures with dry needling, needle insertion technique. We don't learn that in entry-level physical therapy practice, or in schooling, let me say that, or physiological responses to dry needling. So it's very specific to dry needling. So obviously entry level is not going to know that if it's not taught in school. What we are finding now as it's becoming more legal or legalized in other states and in other countries is that they are including TDN as part of the curriculum. And these are just a few examples. What we can expect is schools that are incorporating this into their entry level or into their programs, entry level wise, these people will know, these students will know, these physical therapists will know much more than anyone here in California in regards to dry needling. I wanted to share another thing as well. Physical therapists are seen as musculoskeletal experts, but I want to show you a study that compares us to orthopedists or other physicians, because orthopedists are also known as musculoskeletal experts, right? And just based on the public or your average consumer, we tend to trust orthopedists because they go through a ton of schooling. You always seem to trust a medical doctor more versus a doctor of physical therapy. I'm just speaking from how everyone is, just growing up. When you say doctor, I trust the doctor. Even though I'm doctor of physical therapy, there's a difference between a medical doctor and a doctor of physical therapy. All right. What Childs et al. In their study, what they did is they had participants complete a standardized examination assessing knowledge in managing musculoskeletal conditions. And what they found was they had let me give you the numbers here. They had 174 physical therapy students from 26 random programs and 182 experienced physical therapists from the uniformed services. And they had them go over a standardized examination, and it was developed by Friedman and Bernstein. They usually give this standardized examination to medical students, residents, and such. And what it does is it assesses their knowledge of the musculoskeletal system. All right. And what they found here was that, of course, as we expected, physicians, orthopedists, they had the highest level of knowledge in regards to musculoskeletal system, but PT was next in line. Those with your specialties are going to be, of course, very high, but next in line to those with specialty in PT, orthopedic clinical specialty and sports clinical specialties, just your standard PT was also ranked very high in regards to knowing musculoskeletal systems. On that note, I would like to bring Tony up.
After me. Okay. Good morning. My name's Anthony Trauma. I'm a physical therapist. Been one for going to be 22 years, and I've had most of my career, almost all of it's been in the outpatient, mostly orthopedic setting. I had the privilege to work with Dr. Bishop for a couple of years down at the Marina Marina VA clinic before I transferred out this way earlier this year. And I consider myself a manual therapist. I've had many Con Ed courses, the Mulligan technique, HVLA, muscle energy techniques, myofascial techniques, and they all have their place. I do use them regularly, but hands down, without a doubt, this technique, I get more often good results, quick results, and lasting results. And I think if you use this technique in with all the other skills that we have in our PT toolbox, it can make such a drastic and fast change, and then giving that patient the education of movement, body control, strength, flexibility, things to live their life when they're not in the PT clinic, to further the changes that you make in the treatment. It really works very well, and especially in both settings that I've worked in, both clinics in the VA here in Sacramento and down in Marina. A lot of veterans don't live in the neighborhood. They might drive an hour and a half or 2 hours and be there, and they can't come a couple times a week. And a lot of times we're busy. We can't see people a couple of times a week. I might see them once a month or once every couple of weeks. And this really gives a quick, effective, and lasting intervention that really helps these people recover or improve the quality of their life. And every day it just never ceases to amaze me the change that I can make in such a short time that no other technique that I am privy to or my experience that can make that technique. And I'm proud to be able to offer it, and I do offer it, not on everybody, because not everybody needs it, but a lot of times I do share that with my patients, and I've just been amazed by it and continue to be amazed every day. And it's a privilege to be able to offer that to our veterans and help them with their pain. Okay, so since I am the VA representative as far as a clinician here in the area, we do have the privilege of having a couple of veterans that have had experience with the technique, and they're going to come on and give a short kind of testimony or result with how they experienced dry needling. Mr. Cole?
Hi, good morning. End of April, I was preparing to move from San Jose area up here to Sacramento, and conveniently, I injured my back doing some stupid lifting. I went to my physical therapist in the San Jose facility, and they did some techniques which really had no effect. But one thing they did do that I'm very grateful for is they did a referral to Tony. Upon my arrival here in the Sacramento area, and within a week, Tony called me and brought me in. After an initial consultation, he recommended to me dry needling. Didn't sound good, but he explained it to me, gave me some material to read, reference material, and we went with it. And I think I saw him on Friday, and by Tuesday, I was laying face down on the table, and I was very surprised, very surprised. After the first session, I had a remarkable improvement. I'm a golfer, or at least I try to be a golfer. And all I wanted to do was be able to walk again, get back on the golf course. I think I went through about 4 or 5 sessions. And after about the 5th session, he got me back on the golf course. Did not improve my game any, but I have to say though, it was very short, very quick. I've had physical therapy before in the past on my knees and my back, and it's just a long, prolonged process, and not with the same results that I got out of dry needling. So with saying that, I really want to thank Tony and from what I hear, all these gentlemen here today. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I tried to say hi to you earlier when I shouldn't have. But I am a patient advocate here at McClellan. I was at Mather also. And one of the major things that they are trying to do right now is what they referenced earlier is we're trying to get all our, people come back from the war and stuff off the opiates and painkillers. And I normally, as a patient advocate, we hear complaints. And I was all of a sudden hearing positive things that were coming up, say, oh man, these two people are fantastic. You should see what they do. And we had a presentation in our primary care meeting that we have, and the physical therapist talked about it. So I heard all this stuff happening, and when I was in the Navy, I was a diver, and I fell, I had the hard hat suit on, and fell 10 feet onto a deck, and I hurt my lower back. So I had one of the pictures they had up here, pain in the keister right here. And I'm thinking, okay, well, these guys say it's good. Let me go see what happens. So I went up there and talked to the gal. She goes, yep, put the order in, tell your doctor, do it, come in. So sure enough, lower my pants, I'm on the bed, she puts it inside there. I felt like a knot, didn't hurt, and I could feel the intensity, and then she goes, okay, we're done. And I'm kind of thinking, wow, glad I didn't have to pay for that, And I get up and I walk away, and that has been almost 2 months. I have not had that pain there since, okay? So then a month ago, I'm playing racquetball, and I have one other orthopedic surgeon said, oh, you have problems with your one muscle, rotator cuff, yeah. And I said, okay, and it was really hurting down the arm and everything. So again, I'm back in, put another order in. I go inside there, I lay down, and she feels in the back behind the scapula there. Does it, I'm in and out in 5 minutes. I get done, and it felt like I had been playing racquetball because it was, kind of, there. But since then, I have not had the pain again, and I play 2-3 times a week. So not only now, they are saying, hey, slow down a little because they only have so many appointments, but everyone who comes in, as today, I interrupt him with a patient. I have another nurse here while you need another guy who has a problem. So it's until you've experienced it like I did, plus I'm hearing positive stuff every day instead of negative, we can't go without it, Thank you.
Okay, and then I have a letter from our director from VA Palo Alto. The director he oversees the entire VA system for Palo Alto. It's basically the entire Bay Area. It goes all the way from Menlo Park down to Monterey, across to Modesto, Stockton, and he wanted me to share this. He said, to whom it may concern, it is with great pleasure as director of the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System and United States Army veteran that I write this letter to express my support of trigger point dry needling. As an advocate of physical therapy and therapeutic dry needling, I have seen firsthand the benefit that this service provides. The physical therapy department at VAPA Hicks is one of our most knowledgeable services regarding musculoskeletal pain. I trust them in treating our veterans with the best care, avoiding reliance on excessive medication use, and decreasing consultations toward unnecessary surgeries. Trigger point dry needling is one of their many tools, but is very useful and effective. I understand that VAPA Hicks was one of the first institutions to provide this innovative treatment in California. I know that currently is only available to veterans located in Northern California, primarily in the Bay Area. By basing what I've seen at VAPA Hicks, having therapeutic dry needling be available to all constituents in California would be a significant benefit to their health and well-being. Sincerely, Thomas J. Fitzgerald III, Director.
All right, just wrapping up here. Just in summary, just kind of summarizing what we talked about dry needling. Evidence supports physical therapists performing dry needling due to the below factors. So we've discussed the research regarding our extensive education and background in the musculoskeletal system. We've discussed the research that supports the safety of us performing this. That research study by Rick, it was over 7,000 patients. There were no significant adverse events. We've discussed the effectiveness in terms of some of the literature as well as our personal experiences. And we've also discussed dry needling is based on musculoskeletal myofascial trigger points that are scientifically quantifiable and imageable, historically stemming from local anesthetic injections that progress to dry needling to treat myofascial trigger points. And lastly, by us presenting here today, we in the federal system, we're doing dry needling. We don't gain anything by doing this presentation. If anything, it actually hurts us. The reason is right now we have a leg up on the private sector. As the VA is trying to privatize and think about who they're going to get rid of if they do go that route, we have a toolbox that is vital for veterans that they don't have on the outside. So this is actually becoming a huge tool for us to be able to do this and say, actually, patients are actually waiting 2 to 3 months to see us, even though they could use the community care choice program to be seen on the outside. So they're waiting to come to the VA to be able to see this. And the reason we're doing this is because as in our experience at who we are and in the military, you do things for the greater good. We've seen such vast improvements from our patients that we know that patients will experience such relief from this treatment. So we're doing it more because we know that the patients in California will vastly benefit from being able to do this. And so that's why we're here. And we appreciate you all listening to us and bearing through all of this. So thank you. And I'll just leave the last slides up here while it's just a couple quotes from patients.
So is there any board member comment or question?
So my question is, I'm getting the impression, so if I took a physical therapist right now and give them a patient, and the patient is someone that they can treat with dry needling, I want to just establish how effective would, just because there's no data from what we see, how effective would it be, because you've had training and you all seem solidly competent, what would the average physical therapist, would I get the same result? That's what I'm asking. Is the method so effective for physical therapists to use that any physical therapist could apply this tool and get kind of a standardized, high effective result?
So let me make sure I got that correct. So you're asking if because we've had some excess training in it, that if any physical therapist were trained this, would they get the same results we would get? And I would say one thing that we know is that in the VA we have over 40 therapists that are able to do dry needling, and throughout our VA we're getting results on all sectors. And obviously, it is a tool, and to understand a tool, you do need experience. So with more experience is going to be better results. But again, that's the whole standardization of the military. It's a competency to be able to do this. So all therapists are trained to do dry needling in that exact intent to be able to create a standard of care and to get that same effect. Obviously, because we talked, it's not a standalone treatment, there are going to be variances between other people's knowledge of how to use manual therapy, neuromuscular reeducation that coincide with that treatment. So you're going to get variances in that aspect, but in terms of the treatment itself, with the training, that people, it's a very simple procedure that everyone can get very similar results. It's just how you back it up with the other sort of tools that we have with our examination. I don't think I can give you a very solid answer that said, like, yes, everyone's going to get the same results, but I can tell you that an average therapist could be trained in this and get better results than they've ever had at treating myofascial trigger points. I can definitely say that. Can you get it wrong? Yeah. In what way?
My question was, can you get it wrong in actually implementing the method or using the method? And this is what I mean. You know, you are feeling the muscle and feeling if there is a knot, and then applying to it. What if you don't exactly hit that knot? Will you still get the somewhat of a result? This is all only for my own personal.
So I could definitely say that what we know in the literature is that when you go into that muscle and you get that twitch response, we know you're going to get a better result. So you're saying if I go and maybe I don't get the twitch, right? Oftentimes, at least in my experience, let's say I do my pre-test and I push on that spot and it feels like, ow, that hurts. It's sharp. I do the treatment and let's say I push back on that spot and you say, ow, it's still sharp. You're probably not going to get the best results. So something did not change. But if I go in, and that happens to me. Sometimes I go and I don't hit that right spot. So then I go back and I make sure I get to it to where I push on that spot and they say, oh, feels like a dull ache. There's a change immediately. So for me, I use a pre and a post test to make sure that I can tell if I'm going to get an effect. But there are times I don't get that localized twitch response. I still do get an effect, but it's not quite as good as when I do get the localized twitch response or when I get their symptoms saying, oh, I'm going in their hip and they're saying, oh, that's my pain down my leg. Then I know, boom, I'm at that spot. Hopefully, does that answer your question? Okay.
And just to touch base on your first question is, how can you tell one is better? So we didn't add any of this data into our slide because we didn't get it vetted and we didn't do it at a high quality scientific level, but we're started capturing data once we started using this intervention, kind of what was our metrics like, how many times did we see patients per case pre and post since we started this. So this is kind of more just a general suggestion, like off record, because we didn't get it vetted through our VA. But so we can't compare data. When we send patient cases out, we can see how many cases it takes for a patient we send we call the community to get better. Is it 6 visits, 8 visits? Like how many times does that clinic ask for us to see the patient versus how many times we see a patient per visit, per consult? So in a general sense, this is kind of a plug for the VA, but we trying to see patients about 4 to 5 visits per consult. When we send them out to the community, it takes about 8 or more to kind of get to the point where they discharge them. Then once we started introducing dry needling, and it's hard to extrapolate just specifically this intervention because every case is very robust in what you do, but we did see that our amount of encounters per visit dropped between 1 to 2 visits since we introduced this modality. So say Rusty saw a patient in 6 visits, since using this vision, you probably got it down to 4, which is big for us because we mentioned we have to be very efficient in what we do because of accessibility, our wait times, veterans have to travel really far. We almost have to be the best of the best because we can't keep asking them to come to see us and they want to get back to active duty or the service quickly. So that data in itself, anecdotally through us, meant a lot to us to kind of advocate why we continue to do it.
Mr. Kaiser, you can give me some guidance on this as well, but in the interest of time, maybe allow the public to have some comment and then we will recess to lunch. So any public comment?
I supposed to say good morning, but now I say good afternoon probably. Yeah, my name is Michelle Lau, licensed acupuncture, doctor of the Oriental Medicine, and I'm the president of the Council of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine Associations and the American Alliance of Acupuncture. And we umbrella associations, professional associations in California and nationwide now. So first of all, I very respectfully to thank you have an opportunity to have a public comment. And I really appreciate that listen to the speech that from the physical therapist. And then I appreciate that you're taking proactive effort to treating the need patients. But as an acupuncture profession, we concerned now because this is not only California issues over the whole country, the states. And dry needle become popular. Also, a lot of states, they already have legislation to allow the PT to do the acupuncture. But in California, we has been legalized acupuncture for 42 years, 43 years. And we are training the acupuncture as you call the dry needle. That's the ancient Chinese medicine for acupuncture, the name. Dry needle in many thousand years because the needle is no water, right? It's just like a dry, just a needle. And in fact, the federal FDA, the acupuncture needle just allowed to let the acupuncture to perform that. That's a secondary dangerous instrument, for the acupuncture. And as well, I just heard from beginning, I appreciate the OE, Mr. Jason Kaiser. And also we have an acupuncture OE here too. And we have been talking about dry needle for the past 2 years and really getting to the really hot topic now. So, and we realized that the acupuncturists, and we have been doing the same thing, what you're just saying that, but we are different term. Actually, it's not different term, actually the same. And you can see that we have an acupuncture guideline. We have the 2004 that in California, we have an acupuncture guideline telling how we treat all this kind of problem. It's including the whole body, all the pain, like you say trigger point, that we call reflection point, RC point, that have more explanation to tell why that worked. And then we can performance that too. In fact, that we have a legislation going on the Congress. The 6110 House bill is already passed the Congress. And acupuncture and physical therapists should be the alternative treatment to helping all the opioid patients that stop the painkiller. And acupuncture during that part is that we're treating a lot of patients and they have a suffering different kind of pain. Physical therapists too, using the physical therapy training. So what my concern is now, I try to think that this is very respectfully to be able here and to have a communication with the physical therapist. And in the acupuncture law now, the physical therapist, you cannot practice needling, but you already did. So, and that's a violating the California law for the regulation law, rule. And then second, and the training, I have a question to ask you. When you say that, oh, everybody after training, that they have a very good result. This gentleman, I respectfully, really respect your question. How good the result is. Every physical therapist can get that done, and they have the same result as the speaker that's saying how marvelous and how excellent it is. I believe some people, you go to learn acupuncture privately, not going to the formal education in California, 3,000 hours to just in order to take the state board. But now they training the weekend for only 50 hours or even more, you say 100, whatever it is. And last year we stopped the physical therapists in California to have a seminar, and the court approved that. So anyway, I'm not trying to saying that not good for the physical therapist to practice acupuncture, but you need to have a proper training as much as what we done as a licensed acupuncture in California. So lastly, we really hope that we can work together because this is so important. What we're trying to do, all this kind of different method is try to helping the people. Like what we're going to the bill now, we have 3 bills in the Congress. One is a federal for the veteran bill. That's already 2 years, 3 years. And then also for the Medicare patient, a lot of old people suffer a lot of pain, right? Now the 3rd bill is for the opioid patient that they really don't want to take any more painkiller. So all we can do, to do the best from our profession to treat patient. So hopefully, like what I'm saying, that that become an alternative treatment after the bill passed. That's why 2 weeks from now, we will be in DC. We have a showing that how effective acupuncture work. Once the needle get into it, the patient relieve the pain, just same thing as what you said. Okay, so thank you so much.
Before we take another question, I just want to make sure there's a point of clarity amongst all of us. So that there's a common understanding. So these gentlemen are offering dry needling services under the auspices of the Veteran Affairs System. So that's a federal system. So as long as they're not treating outside of a military base or treating California consumers, they're not what we would consider jurisdictional to the California Physical Therapy Board. So I just want to make sure that a violation of the Physical Therapy Practice Act in California can't actually occur unless they, absolutely.
Well, I totally understand that because the other state that goes through the legislation, that physical therapists could be legally to practice dry needle. Well, that's the other states. But in California, I understand that. But I just heard the people asking some patient get out from the VA, then they practice in the private. So that's not the case. That's not, we won't, this is not our issue. The issue is saying that if we physical therapists try to practice dry needle, we say dry needle is acupuncture, using the dry needle. And the acupuncture needle. So we need to follow the California regulation law. That's my point.
And we concur with that point. The statement that I made before we entered into the presentation, I think I was very clear, right? So based on the Medical Practice Act and the PT Practice Act, California physical therapists licensed in California are prohibited from penetrating tissue of any kind, with the exceptions of electroneuromyography and kinesiological neuromyography. And should that occur, there would be an investigation open, and should it be appropriate, discipline handed to that physical therapist for practicing outside of their scope.
Hello. Okay. So first off, we have great respect for the acupuncture community, and I also recommend acupuncture for patients I treat. But just an example, that patient case I gave you, he had acupuncture 1 week prior to seeing me. I didn't say that because I don't want it to be an effectiveness of acupuncture versus dry needling. But I asked him about his acupuncture experience and what he described, and I asked him, was this similar? And he said, absolutely not. They started at my head, they went down my back, all the way to my foot. So it was very different in his perspective. And then that acupuncturist said that he needed to come back every week for a year, and that kind of turned him off. And so, and again, I strongly believe acupuncture has helped a ton of my patients. But in my 6 years of doing dry needling, I always ask if they've had acupuncture, because everyone says, oh, you're just going to do acupuncture. And I ask him, is this similar to what you experienced in acupuncture? And I've not gotten one person who has said, that is what I received in acupuncture. That being said, I'm going to I'll give it to Teo, because he has a comment about how we work with acupuncturists within the VA.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch base on that point, because we have a very unique model system of care in the VA. So we have many clinics where we have PTs, occupational therapists, chiropractors, acupuncturists who work out of the same clinic, literally the same clinic, where we all sit and treat patients in the same clinic. And what we've kind of created a model system on is how we can easily triage and transfer patients within one service based on what we find. So, for example, a lot of times, consult from our primary care doctors will come to the PT first, and we'll look at the eval and triage them, and we might pick up really quick, you know what, from our evaluation, I feel that the chiropractic in the clinic might be better served than what I'm seeing from my evaluation findings. So we'll hand off the patient right there and say, hey, Brett or John Smith, I think this patient's right up your alley. And they'll screen them and say, yep, let me go in there and do my treatment. Or they might come in and we might not find anything that we find is treatable. And then we might pass off the chiropractor and say, you know what, this is outside my scope too. And they'll touch base with the acupuncturist in the clinic and say, you know what, this might be something in your realm and they'll do their assessment and say, yes, this is perfect indication for us, we'll treat them. And so we work collectively and always talk about what we're trying to treat, what's our intention. My boss is an acupuncturist, he's a physician at our PM&R clinic. We talk about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to collaborate. When we talk to our acupuncturists in the clinic, we kind of understanding that what we're doing, what they're doing is different. And that's why we consult each other a lot. Our acupuncturists will send patients to us, we'll send it to them. So try to keep what's, in the end of the game, it's what's best for the patient, what's going to get them their outcome that we want. We're not shy to pass it off to who we think is going to get the most effective treatment. Because from a patient's perspective, and I would assume from a consumer's perspective, they don't really care who's going to get them better and back to their goals, whoever's going to get them quickest. So we're trying to funnel and triage that patient down the right system of care in our VA system to get them to that output point where they're back at home with their family, with their kids, and the active duty. So that's kind of the model care we approach, and just wanted to share that with you guys.
Not the most limber one in the room, so I apologize.
Thanks. Just for the record, I'm Floris Van der Ven, physical therapist. I have a fairly specific question for you, and that's about, do you allow your support personnel, PTAs and aides, to provide dry needling as well, or is it specifically limited to physical therapists?
Yeah, no, sorry. Oh, whoops. What's this low battery?
Here, go with this one. Go with this one. You got it?
Correct. No, only licensed physical therapists who can evaluate and examine and treat. We limit to their scope. We don't have PTAs do it in our system.
So on behalf of the board, I want to thank the VA for coming and providing this information to the board and this presentation to our audience and anyone who might be watching on webcast. I want to thank the audience for their participation in the presence of your organization and giving your comments as well. And so right now we're going to break for recess. I don't know what time it is. 12:30, so we will probably be back in an hour. 1:30 back here to resume. 1:45. 1:30, 1:45. Thank you very much.